Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
The internet is full of half-truths and all-out lies. We've all seen them, and many people on social media complaining about it. Here's your chance to show and prove. WorldAfropedia.com is a black-owned and operated encyclopedia. There are several thousand articles, but we need help. We can't uncover all the truth ourselves. So please, join us and become a writer, editor, or blogger for WorldAfropedia.com today. Every little bit counts. We owe it to the future generations to put the truth out there. Visit WorldAfropedia.com, the African-centered encyclopedia, a global database of African knowledge for the purpose of bringing about global African wisdom and understanding. WorldAfropedia.com.
The Clemson University board met and released a statement speaking out against Benjamin Tillman, one of its founders. WYFF News 4's Nigel Robertson was there, and he joins us now with more. Nigel?
Carol Tillman was known by his own admission to be a racist and led a campaign of terror against African Americans in South Carolina. The Board of Trustees says that it finds Tillman's views repugnant. Tillman Hall, one of 3 original buildings on the Clemson campus, was named after Benjamin Tillman. He played a key role in founding the university and was appointed as one of its original trustees. He also served as governor of South Carolina and as a U.S. senator. But Tillman's name has become one of division. Some students and faculty have rallied to have the name of Tillman Hall changed. Today, I asked the board chairman if a name change is on the table.
Well, it's not on the table, and the General Assembly made it very clear, as recent as yesterday, that it's not on the table for anyone. So we're going to concentrate on improving our university in many ways and improving diversity and being more sensitive, but at the same time, we're looking for the future. We're not going to look for the past.
The board announced today that it is forming a task force to review how it recognizes historical figures and make sure diversity is honored and celebrated at the university.
Context of White Supremacy. Gus T Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date, Friday, July 24th, 2015. So I have been told this is our 5th study session on Ben Tillman and the Reconstruction of White Supremacy. We should be halfway done with the book this week, making progress. We will be picking up on page 121, second paragraph, kind of the top of the page, 121. The audio clip that you heard at the beginning this week, that was from last Friday. I think that happened just a few hours before we went live with our book study session from last Friday. The interesting thing is that you heard in that audio clip, right, the white officials at Clemson announced and talk about, we find Benjamin Tillman, his views and what have you, repugnant, and we'll have to see how we're going to move forward to promote diversity and all this other nonsense. But if you look at their statement, they have a full about paragraph or so statement that they released on all of this, I guess, that they came to last Friday. And also keep in mind that they've been meeting about this, Ben Tillman and Tillman Hall, they've been meeting about this for at least a year, where folks have been protesting and saying that this guy is racist, that some of this is racist damage control from Charleston. But in my view, the most important sentence in their statement that they released, I put it in the description for the program. It reads, "For some members of our university family, Benjamin Tillman's legacy included not only contributions to Clemson University, but also oppression, terror, and hate." Now, that's for some members, as though there are some individuals, when they think of Ben Tillman, they do not include his history, unashamed legacy of terrorizing and killing black people. I thought that was a very curious way of wording it. In my opinion, it could even be a practice of racism, to make it seem as though this is something that's subjective. To me, it almost sounded like one of those when they say this is our truth. Maybe your truth is that Tillman's legacy includes this, but this is not our truth, which is it's total nonsense, practice of racism. Anywho, we'll get started. Context of White Supremacy. Ben Tillman, Reconstruction of White Supremacy. We are on chapter 4, page 121.
When Tillman attacked individual members of the Democratic leadership, these men often responded as though he had provoked them into an affair of honor. But although Tillman delighted in sparking outrage, he showed no interest in giving or demanding personal satisfaction. In 1885, he sought to make an alliance with Luther Ransom, Columbia correspondent for the Augusta Chronicle and secretary to the State Agricultural Commissioner, A.P. Butler. Privately, Tillman all but promised Ransom the secretaryship of a proposed farmers' legislature in exchange for favorable newspaper coverage, and he suggested that Ransom could do this without jeopardizing his bread and butter. But when Tillman publicly charged Butler's agricultural department with wasting money, Ransom defended his employer and attacked Tillman. Tillman responded by writing publicly that Ransom was trying perhaps to earn his salary and keep his place, fighting for potatoes rather than for principles. He warned Ransom to cease his insinuations and attack me like a man, and then I shall know how to answer him. Ransom took what in an earlier decade would have been the only honorable course. Tillman, he wrote, lied, L-I-E-D. No insinuation about that, I hope, Benjamin. But Tillman had no interest in satisfying his own or anyone else's agreed sense of honor. He might declare that he could not now remain silent without being accused of having fled at the first glint of steel, and he sometimes used words such as insulting and resent that echoed antebellum preliminaries, but he refused to be goaded into a duel. After Ransom's charge, Tillman reminded readers that dueling was now illegal in South Carolina, and that if he issued a challenge using weapons to put us on an equality, if I killed him, it would be murder. A few years ago, my reply would have been a challenge, but it is no longer either safe or honorable to fight duels in South Carolina, and Major Ransom knows it. He explained in rejecting non-lethal confrontation, he landed another blow. Ransom was not physically his equal, Tillman claimed, and he would as soon strike a woman. The issue at stake was collective rights, not individual reputations. Ransom's challenge was the act of a Hessian, a mercenary in the service of the state leadership, and it demanded a collective rather than a personal response. Tillman's poverty-stricken, debt-enslaved, tax-ridden farmers are organizing from the mountains to the sea to take on the Columbia Ring. That had set Ransom against him. Tillman was interested not in exchanging pistol shots, but in defining and mobilizing white manhood, organizing the farmers. Tillman offered the farmers a stark and simple choice: organize, 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 or in the language that his audience would have understood in both literal and symbolic terms, remain slaves. In Tillman's rhetoric, slavery functioned as a present symbol as well as a historical memory. It was time, he said, for the emancipation of agriculture among us from the shackles of debt and ignorance. Cooperation redeemed us from radical slavery, and cooperation will redeem us from commercial slavery. But Tillman was not entirely convinced that his farmers were capable of such sustained and disciplined effort. Reconstruction rule, he explained to audiences, had deadened white farmers' instincts for citizenship. A more galling slavery was never endured by any people, Tillman explained. Our bodies were free, but our minds became benumbed, deadened. The disuse of citizenship made us unfit to be citizens, and we farmers, by reason of our volition, have suffered more than all others because of this fatal lethargy. This mental slavery is more hopeless than a merely physical bondage, and unless we throw off these shackles of the mind and become free in truth as well as in name, there is no hope for us. Rather than remain dependent on others to serve farmers' interests, a dependence neither wise nor manly, farmers should exert their proper influence. At times, he seemed to doubt that wisdom and manliness would prevail. He mocked those who lacked the gumption to join the farmers' movement. My God, he privately explained to a trusted ally how pitifully scarce true men are. Publicly, too, he warned that if there are any Miss Nancys among you who are afraid to exercise your rights as citizens and taxpayers to discuss these and other questions so vital to our interests, you had as well withdraw. Only farmers who saw their interests clearly could be relied on to vote for measures and not for men. But everywhere, individually and collectively, white farming men seemed all too ready to give up, or in more directly charged language, to submit. And Tillman worried that sleepy agricultural giant will sink into quiet submission again soon. All around him, blind and ignorant white men neglected their obligations as agricultural citizens. He confessed to one ally that he felt sick at heart sometimes when I think of leaving my children among these gullies and surrounded by these dead people, for, with one or two exceptions, my neighbors are utterly and hopelessly stupid, non-progressive. Other farmers he thought lacking independence of mind had become bamboozled or manipulated into serving the ring bosses. Real white men could never accept such a role. In fact, perhaps such men deserved to remain slaves. Tillman's goal was to rouse these white men, spurring them to reclaim the Democratic Party and thus the state. And from the moment he rose to speak in Bennettsville in 1885, he attracted the attention of like-minded men throughout South Carolina and even beyond. Some of his earliest allies were former red shirts and their sons, men like Martin Gary's nephew Eugene Frank Gary and John Gary Evans. Tax-cutting up-country legislatures like G.W. Shell wrote to introduce themselves, and local farmers' clubs invited him to speak, giving him the opportunity to meet a variety of men prominent at the county level, from the ambitious professionals like John L. McLaurin and J.L.M. Irby to substantial but unpolished farmers like Aaron Cannon and Henry Byrne. This emerging reform leadership did not represent the revolt of a reactionary Old South. Many leaders of the farmers' movement were what historian Randolph Warner has described as regional capitalists, men invested financially and psychologically in the developing economy. Tillman's disciple, John Gary Evans, for example, served as an agent for Northern land and credit interests. Overall, the movement's local leaders represented a wide range of regional and political economic constituencies, but they all shared a dissatisfaction with the post-Reconstruction order. In the mid-1880s, Tillman traveled across the state, hoping to knit local and county farmers' clubs into permanent state farmers' conventions, what he called a farmers' legislature. This representative society would naturally supplant and take the place of the present close corporation known as the State Agricultural Society in a few years. He was eagerly received by like-minded local landowners. The people of Colleton are lawyer and merchant written, wrote the president of a county agricultural association, and have been running in the groove so long that I want just such help as you can give me to break their chains. Our people, the farmers, are quite cheered at the prospect of seeing and hearing you speak. Others wrote to offer support and to mention the names of additional potential allies. Believing that disgruntled Democrats were desperate for such a movement and knowing that wide publicity was crucial to this effort, Tillman made a critical early alliance with Charleston News and Courier editor F.W. Dawson. An independent movement would have arisen if nothing had been done to provide reform. He told Dawson privately in early 1886, economic hardship and aristocratic arrogance had strained the bonds of white unity to the breaking point. If the leadership did not reform its ways, it is only a question of time and not very long off at that when the Democratic Party will be broken up. Tillman warned the editor. One ally, he said, had told him that our people are not going to submit to this kind of thing forever. Nothing but a political earthquake will bring this crowd to its senses. Of course, he went on, I do not share in such thoughts, for I would never under any circumstances have anything to do with pulling down our democratic temple. He shared the same fear articulated by the Edgefield Advertiser in 1878 that a calamitous class division among white men would lead both sides to make an expedient alliance with the black majority. The devil is always tempting men to use the Negro vote to carry their end, and sooner or later it will become the balance of power between the rich feeling Bourbons and the poor feeling and more progressive among our people. I fear this. God grant I am mistaken. In the long letters Dawson subsequently printed, Tillman was equally explicit about the dangers. He will be a bold man, he wrote in 1887, who will say that the farmers' movement has not been a godsend to save the Democratic Party from its own incipient rottenness while presenting a solid front to all comers on the bond of white supremacy. Dawson printed Tillman's articles and supported the agricultural plan. In exchange, Tillman ceased his attacks on the Citadel and tried to convince his followers to do so as well. Tillman also agreed to sell the editor some fancy hams he had produced, beginning a side business as a purveyor of farm goods to the Charleston elite. This short-term alliance served its purpose by making Tillman's ideas available to a statewide audience. Like James Henry Hammond, 2 generations before, Tillman claimed to see an almost spontaneous uprising of the people. Dawson printed Tillman's articles and supported the agricultural plan. In exchange, Tillman ceased his attacks on the Citadel and tried to convince his followers to do so as well. Tillman also agreed to sell the editor some fancy hams he had produced, beginning a side business as a purveyor of farm goods to the Charleston elite. This short-term alliance served its purpose by making Tillman's ideas available to a statewide audience. Like James Henry Hammond 2 generations before, Tillman claimed to see an almost spontaneous uprising of the people. The fire was everywhere, smoldering and ready to burst out. I have only fanned it into flame and brought the dissatisfaction which existed to a head. Such metaphors are convenient for those who fail to see political movements as the products of human agency, or for those who wish to make such efforts seem natural. In fact, the movement's early growth had been anything but spontaneous, having been immersed throughout his adulthood in South Carolina's militia assemblies, club meetings, and nominating conventions. Tillman understood the principles of practical political organization in the state. 25 men in each county can, by agitating and work, carry the legislature provided they don't run for office themselves, he told confident Charles Crossland. To pull local movement forces together, Tillman called a statewide meeting in April 1886 in Columbia. The proceedings, needless to say, were anything but spontaneous. In a caucus on the eve of the convention, Tillman met in his hotel room with members of each county's delegation, seeking to ensure a degree of common understanding and consensus. The convention itself was Tillman's from start to finish. The first day was dominated by his speech, and the second day by the passage of his proposals, including his plans for financial reform in the state institutions and an agricultural college. The convention's participants included several hundred white men representing various factions within the state Democratic Party, but no black delegates or representatives. Leading conservative figures attended and helped ensure that their political leader, Governor Hugh Thompson, would be invited to address the convention. Local bosses such as Milton L. Donaldson of Greenville gained leadership posts. At the other extreme of the white political spectrum, former Greenback leader and sometime Republican W.W. Russell attended as a member of an upcountry delegation. Although Tillman and his lieutenants took care to hammer home their commitment to white supremacy and the Democratic Party, no direct objection to Russell's participation was reported. The purpose of the convention and of the movement generally was to control the state Democratic Party from within. Once delegations returned from 1886 Columbia Convention, Tillmanites scheduled Farmers Club meetings to precede Democratic Club meetings and county farmers conventions to precede county Democratic assemblies. In a bill, for example, the County Farmers Association met just before the County Democratic Convention in order to suggest which delegates ought to be sent to the State Democratic Convention. Once the farmers' meeting adjourned, the Democratic County Club was immediately called to order, apparently in the same location. The Democratic Assembly then elected 11 delegates to the State Party Convention, including the 8 suggested by the Farmers' Convention. Next door in Edgefield, Tillman himself became chairman of the executive committee of the County Democratic Party and was a delegate to the 1886 State Party Convention. For the moment, however, political success for the farmers' movement stopped at the county level. Tillman declined to run for governor, and the movement's alternative candidates for that office failed to achieve nomination. As late as 1888, statewide office eluded the farmers' movement, as legislators denied Tillman the first office he sought beyond the county level, a seat on the Board of Agriculture. The state party leadership remained in conservative hands. Tillman's unwillingness to run for governor stemmed in part from the fear he had articulated to Crossland at the outset. If he came to be perceived as a mere office seeker, his message would lose its power. Indeed, throughout the early phases of the movement, Tillman struggled to strike a balance between presenting himself as the leader of the farmers and claiming to be only their humble servant. The military language with which he described the movement complicated matters. We are an army of 60,000 white voters, farmers all, against 20,000 of all other classes, he declared. The man some had dubbed Moses required his proudly independent farmers to rally as a disciplined army and to accept that discipline voluntarily. The way out of this wilderness is very plain. Even I can lead you out, but I cannot either drive or carry you out on my back. Who would be free himself must strike the blow. One sharp shooter, no matter how bold, can only annoy our masters. No skirmish line, however, can take this fortress or obtain redress for our grievances. If you feel incompetent to lead, be ready to follow. And if you can't exactly have your own way, don't sulk. Either quit grumbling or fall in. And having chosen your leaders, follow them and obey orders. But Tillman feared presenting the appearance that he was dictating to other white men. I trust I am numbered among South Carolina's free men, declared one white man during the 1890 campaign, and that I am not anybody's ite. The potential for such protests was never far from Tillman's mind. I am giving instructions like a general, he explained in early 1886, but I am ready, willing, and anxious to get in the ranks if others will take the lead. He was at pains to deny that the movement needed his particular leadership and to establish that his role required the consent of the organized. The pent-up indignation of the farmers has found a voice through me, and the masses of our people are ready to follow anyone, however insignificant, who has the boldness to lead. I did not commence this agitation with any such expectation, but I should be a coward to refuse to lead, at least till we organize. He was right to be anxious. After the April 1886 convention, a hostile Columbia reporter suggested that Tillman had served as a molder of the action of the convention. In a political culture where men prized their freedom from being driven or directed by others, the insinuation was clear. The delegates were Tillman creatures, not free men. The Democratic leadership proved resilient enough to withstand Tillman's early charge, and by the end of 1887, it appeared that the farmers' movement might be disintegrating. At the poorly attended December convention, a dissident faction reportedly even attempted to dislodge Tillman from the organization's leadership. Frustrated by failure in January of 1886, Tillman sent Dawson a bitter farewell speech in which he announced his intention to retire to the shadows of private life. His own agricultural undertakings had suffered since he took on the role of agricultural Moses, he explained, and his wife opposed his continued activism. I have neglected and sacrificed the interests of my wife and children, he wrote, and I can't afford the costly luxury of reform any longer. But a few months later, one reform effort suddenly paid off, rescuing Tillman from political obscurity. In the autumn of 1886, Tillman had met with Thomas Green, Clemson, heir to John C. Calhoun's upcountry plantation, to ask him to consider endowing an agricultural college. When Clemson died in April 1886, he left a large plantation, $60,000 in cash, and a will laying out the terms under which the state could transform his estate into an agricultural college. Tillman and 6 other men were to be named life trustees of the college. These men would make up more than half the college's board and would have the power to name their successors. Tillman later stated that this provision was intended to keep any future radical government from admitting black students. It also quietly ensured that low-country conservatives would not be able to dismantle the institution by more subtle means. The Clemson bequest re-energized both the movement and its founder. Old Clemson's expiring spark set the woods on fire, ultimately forcing the state government to found the college for which Tillman had fought. Simultaneously, a wave of organizational energy from another source revitalized the farmers' movement. Throughout and beyond the South, farmers facing economic hardship had begun to join the Farmers Alliance. Like Tillman's Farmers Association, the alliance was rooted in local chapters called sub-alliances, but the alliance's goal were far more ambitious than physical reform or the creation of an agricultural college. County and state alliances founded cooperatives for the purchase and sale of agricultural products and supplies, offering not only a powerful critique of merchants, middlemen, and the money power, but an alternative as well. Members rallied behind regional and national anti-monopoly activities, including the national boycotts. Although technically a non-political organization, the alliance dominated reform politics for a time in many southern plains and mountain states and ultimately spawned the People's Party. The alliance overlapped substantially with Tillman's farmers' movement, and its explosive growth offered Tillman a new platform and his constituents new energy. Beginning in 1887, South Carolina farmers organized numerous sub-alliances, county alliances, and finally a state alliance.
Men Tillman perceived as close regional allies, notably North Carolina's Leonidas Lafayette Polk, became state and national alliance leaders. Outsiders routinely conflated Tillman's movement with that of the alliance, and one correspondent believed that the Farmers Association might merge with the alliance, in which it seems all the farmers have their hearts. The South Carolina Farmers Alliance did indeed attract the same dissatisfied white owners and renters, primarily the former, who had been drawn to Tillman's Farmers Association. According to statistics collected by the alliance's national organ, the National Economist, white South Carolina Alliance men were on the average wealthier than their non-alliance neighbors. Over half the dues-paying members in the fall of 1888 owned the land they farmed. Nearly a third farmed but did not own, and the rest were women and dependent children, doctors, ministers, teachers, and rural mechanics. In Union, an observer approvingly described local white alliance men as the best class of farmers, educated men, the stanch yeomanry, not men of bickering or sorehead sort. The same men who had rallied to Tillman now took their places in the state alliance leadership. E.T. Stackhouse, who had been a Farmers Association leader since early 1886, became the state alliance's first president. The overlaps between the leadership and rank and file of the alliance and those of the farmers movement could lead to procedural gymnastics. In 1892, for example, the Anderson County Alliance adjourned its quarterly meeting so that distinguished gentlemen invited by the Farmers Association might address the people. By 1889, the alliance seemed to be the most dynamic force in state farmers' politics, a paradox of sorts, since the alliance was supposed to be nonpartisan. At the state alliance meeting in July 1889, Stackhouse reported 20,000 members statewide, including men in nearly every county. Tillman himself joined the organization somewhat belatedly in 1889, immediately taking charge of the Edgefield County organization. But this delayed recognition of the alliance's importance suggested that Tillman was no longer leading but following. The state's alliance leaders included foes as well as friends of Tillman's, and he would face challenges both from those who wanted the alliance to stay out of politics entirely and from those who wanted to help the alliance fulfill its radical potential. Citizens, soldiers, and drunk-driven cattle. At the beginning of 1890, under the name of Tillmanite leader G.W. Shell, and the Charleston News and Courier published a call for a March statewide farmers' convention. The purpose of the convention, explained the Shell manifesto, was to suggest a farmers' candidate for governor, a man who would then have a formidable head start in the race. The author of this effort to preempt the Democratic Party's own processes, as well as the manifesto itself, was obviously Ben Tillman. The Shell Manifesto set off a year-long controversy among the state's Democrats over the fine line between leadership and demagoguery that devolved into harsh words and almost into violence. Tillman and his enemies accused one another of manipulating their followers and leading them down false and even dangerous paths in a political culture that considered Republican independence the essence of reasonable citizenship. It was a serious matter to charge that men had allowed themselves to be misled, manipulated, or driven. Tillman might be vulnerable to many attacks, but his opponents turned out to be even more vulnerable, and their efforts to portray him as a demagogue or dictator backfired, making it appear that they, not he, had little regard for the independence of hard-pressed white men. The Clemson bequest and the emergence of the Farmers Alliance helped Tillman remain in the spotlight, but only his enemies' attacks enabled him to identify himself as the friend of the ordinary white farmer. The Shell Manifesto laid out Tillman's vision of South Carolina's history as a tale of two classes. The legitimate citizenry consisted of the farmers, whose devotion to political virtue, household order, and agricultural prosperity had brought them nothing but hardship. Instead, an illegitimate aristocracy governed the state for its own benefit. South Carolina has never had a real Republican government, the document asserted. Since the days of the Lords Proprietors, it has been an aristocracy under the forms of democracy. Tillman's campaign of personal insinuation and public attack succeeded in the early 1890s because many of his targets did indeed seem to assume that they represented the wealth and intelligence of the state. They did expect to hold the state's top offices, and they did regard men who scratched at the soil and dressed in shapeless clothes as their social inferiors. As Tillman goaded them from the pages of newspapers and the platforms of Democratic stump meetings, he attracted support from the disgruntled rank and file.
When his adversary used his behavior and his followers as proof of Tillman's demagoguery and disreputability, they revealed their own profoundly elitist notions of citizenship and leadership by attacking Tillman, especially by attacking him as dishonorable or disreputable. They helped him become the symbolic champion of the farmers. Many of Tillman's enemies believed that the fraudulence of his claim to speak for ordinary white farmers would soon become clear. Tillman's wealth in 1890, over 1,700 acres of land valued at over $10,000 and 40 head of cattle made him something other than an ordinary farmer man. More to the point, Tillman often spoke and behaved in ways that threatened to undermine his status as the champion of poor farmers. For his point of reference was always that of a land-owning employer. He frequently argued that impending bankruptcy stares thousands in the face while other thousands are overseeing their own plantations for the victuals and clothes. A description of subsistence agriculture that only the wealthiest fraction of white society would have understood as anything out of the ordinary. His attacks on the crop lien system and his call to repeal the lien law brought charges that he and other advocates of repeal sought to reduce the tenants, the renters, and others who are unable to produce supplies except by liens to the level of hired hands for wages, or to reduce all farming in South Carolina to the boss system of agriculture. During the 1890 campaign, one legislature claimed that several years before, Tillman had asked him to help repeal the lien law when he had refused on the grounds that it would deprive his poor white constituents of the credit they needed to raise crops. Tillman had supposedly replied, "Well, put them to work for wages and you can control them." Also, a decade after he helped to ensure its passage, the stock law briefly came back to haunt Tillman. During his 1892 re-election campaign, Tillman received an urgent letter asking him to refute rumors damaging to his cause among poorer white men that he had favored and headed the petition to pass the general stock law. Of course, he could do no such thing since the damaging rumors were entirely true. Pettier allegations, true and false, were brought to bear by Tillman's second term as governor. Hostile commentators would accuse him of turning Clemson into a dude factory, wearing kid clubs and dressing in style. Some charges might not have seemed so petty. One neighbor nursed a grievance against Tillman that echoed other white men's outrage at upper-class arrogance. Edgefield farmer J.C. Shaw wrote to the new governor in 1891 that for years he had begged you, written you as a friend and gentleman, to keep your wagons off my growing crops. Tillman had not complied, and now Shaw was forced to threaten him. "Now, Mr. Tillman, will you tell me, what do you want? Is it trouble, or what is it? I do not go about you or anything you have. Now, if you are a man, for God's sake, let me alone." Here was a Ben Tillman who was conscious of his own class interest and dismissive of a poor white man's prerogatives, and even most disturbing, in a self-styled agricultural reformer, his subsistence. Tillman called himself a plain, blunt man who tells his thoughts and views straight at the mark, but he set a low priority on factual accuracy or consistency. Over and over, he charged opponents with conspiracy, corruption, and incompetence, only to retreat when challenged, declaring that he had not meant to impugn any particular individual. After he described the agricultural leadership as broken-down politicians and old, superannuated bourbon aristocrats who are thoroughly incompetent, he added that he meant no reflection on the current board of agriculture. When his dude factory reference to the Citadel provoked an outcry, Tillman agreed to stop using the phrase, remarking that although these were his sentiments, he didn't want to offend anyone. In the coming months, however, he continued to deploy the phrase in political speeches. After Governor Thompson addressed the April 1886 Farmers' Convention, despite facing veiled accusations of misappropriating agricultural funds, Tillman first denied that he had accused the state officials of robbery and corruption, then immediately made those very charges, accusing the last legislature of misrule in rejecting reapportionment, and deploring the lien law and the lack of legislation against the manufacture of impure fertilizers as robbery. When Sumter, Delegate John J. Dargan, a conservative lawyer skeptical of the movement, protested Tillman's treatment of the governor, Tillman responded that he had no animosity against any man or class of men, but the lawyers and merchants had dominated the legislature for the past 10 years, and who knew it more than the gentleman from Sumter? Only repeated insinuations against
and confrontations with state officials he believed could generate sustained interest. A disillusioned former ally claimed that Tillman had admitted that he had made false accusations so as to give notoriety to the movement. Another opponent referred to Tillman's attacks, random shots fired into the multitude that strike innocent parties, as audaciously reckless and dangerous to the public welfare, although they may be intended merely as political devices for the attainment of political ends. Even some allies grew uncomfortable with Tillman's tactics, urging him in 1888 meeting to be careful in his public utterance and to stick to the facts and to not make statements he could not prove. Tillman understood both the benefits and potential pitfalls of his tactics. He struck out some sarcastic allusions in a letter to the Charleston News and Courier, although he wistfully told the editor they had been spicy and they would be enjoyed by many of your readers. Some of Tillman's victims finally began to understand how badly their counterattacks had backfired. From the beginning, the Edgefield Chronicle had suggested that there is a better way of killing Mr. Tillman than by abusing him and his friends, and that is to let him alone. Breaking with his former ally over outrageous attacks, Dawson proposed a campaign of silence against Tillman. Do not allow his name to appear in the News and Courier when it is possible to avoid it, he instructed his colleague J.C. Hemphill, who edited the paper after Dawson's death in 1889. But men like Hemphill frequently could not resist. These gentry regard me as the devil, Tillman gleefully told a confidant after the Shell manifesto. Of course, the Charleston News and Courier could hardly avoid allowing Tillman's name to appear. Over and over during the early 1890s, however, Tillman's foes could not resist attacking him in ways that identified him with the very men whose support he needed. In part, this was a matter of style rather than wealth. Tillman might have been a wealthy man and a local political leader, but he did not have the polish or bearing of the state's traditional leadership. His plantation house during the 1880s was a simple 5-room dwelling. His recreational tastes ran to books rather than elaborate dinners or balls, and in a basically favorable biographical account, the Edgefield Chronicle nonetheless described him as an ascetic and unsociable. His clothes, some noted, were not well tailored, and his unfashionably shapeless hats in particular came in for satirical commentary. Hostile newspapers advised the women of the state to stay away from the campaign meetings at the risk of having their modesty shocked and their sex insulted by Tillman's use of profanity. Even Tillman's physical person, his missing eye, could inspire upper-class derision. In their outrage at Tillman's attacks, his opponents overplayed their hand, treating the maverick planter with the same elitist disdain they showed for mill-working tackies, rough-hewn country folk, and even middling white legislators. Tillman's enemies in Columbia and Charleston handed him a weapon he could never have forged on his own. Tillmanite candidates for the legislature endured derisive descriptions. In private, one opponent portrayed the reform-dominated 1894 legislature as strangers in a foreign land, as indeed they were made to feel in Columbia. Tillmanite legislature Josh Ashley, a colorful figure known widely as Josh, came in for harsh treatment by the anti-Tillman Columbia State, which presented his speeches in a nearly impenetrable dialect and mocked him for riding in second-class train cars. State editor Narciso Gonzalez likened Tillman voters to black men, mockingly pairing the political slogan 1872, "Vote for Grant, he emancipated you," with its contemporary equivalent in 1892, "Vote for Tillman, he emancipated you." The substitution of an E for the apostrophe would hardly have mollified the white men he compared to freedmen, slavishly casting their ballots for a man who cared nothing about them. Rural whites who would have had little trouble decoding the assumptions and prejudices suggested by such portraits. Mill workers at the time, still mostly seasonal laborers or recent refugees from the farm, would have felt the same sting. In private, one woman described Tillman himself as a degraded poor white. She wrote that on a train Tillman had behaved like a tacky, put his head on the arm of the seat and his feet up in the window and had his mouth open and went fast asleep. Opponents' undifferentiated disdain for Tillman and his wool hats only bound those unlikely allies closer together. Such opposition helps us wonderfully, Schell had noted in the early days of the movement, and one opponent suggested to Tillman that demonstrations against the 1890s convention, not the convention itself, had made him. Tillman denied this, but in discussing a candidate who had been outspoken in abusing the farmers' movement, believed he could whip him the easier for taking that tack. To be denounced was to join a noble lineage. Thomas Jefferson noted a leading Tillmanite was called a rank demagogue and vile agitator. The federal press were about as bitter in their denunciation of Mr. Jefferson and his politics as are the old liners or ringsters in denouncing Mr. Tillman. Governor Tillman lives, yes, lives in the very hearts and souls of his one Gala's boys, declared the Edgefield admirer. He knows the dear old farmer, raised to toil and hardships, will stick to him. Therefore, he does not hesitate to fight for us. Tillman's claims to be a backwoodsman and farmer only were indeed laughable, but as opponents attempted to rebut such claims, they often ended up validating Tillman's assertion that aristocrats believed that commoners were unable to think or act for themselves. L.W. Youmans, a low-country conservative and bitter foe, charged that Tillman's talk about being out at the elbows don't amount to anything when you remember that in 1880 he said that he ran 30 plows and now he comes here and poses as a poor man. But Youmans suggested that Tillman's ploy worked only because farmers could not accurately distinguish between real and fake allies. If I were to cry poor man and go before the country, I too could get some votes, he explained, setting himself apart from poor rural folk in a way that undermined the very point he was trying to make. Less prominent but equally hostile observers unthinkingly betrayed the same distance from poor white men's plight. Tillman, declared a writer to the Charleston News and Courier, portrayed himself as a clodhopper, the poor farmer boy, and the one Gallus boy. But this is only when he is seeking to get the farmer's vote. Correspondent E.B. Murray warned readers that if Tillman succeeded in repealing the lien law, respectable white men would be forced to hire themselves and their families as servants to men who had money enough to run without the lien law. But rather than identifying himself as one of those struggling farmers, Murray stood apart. The closest he could come was to reminisce about the bonds forged among white men in 1876 when the tenant class rode with us on many a night. Tillman and others portrayed their movement as the literal and metaphorical sequel to the Red Shirt Uprising, and they invoked the white solidarity of 1876 without condescending to the tenant class. To an Edgefield supporter, the 1890s convention's gathering of the representatives of those who tanned their skin and soiled their clothes in making bread for the millions represented a union of the men who wore the red shirts in 76 and saved South Carolina at the ballot box. Edgefield Tillmanite H.H. Towns urged freeborn white men to remember the recent past, men who had to rise at midnight, leave your wives and children exposed to the mercy of brutal Negroes whose passion had been excited to the frightful pitch by scallywags and carpetbaggers. Do you remember? Tillman lauded members of his political army for asserting themselves and their rights against a haughty foe. With the farmers' movement to strengthen their backbone, they have witnessed the cajolery, threats, and impotent rage of the old ring bosses, he declared. Whereas his foes placed themselves at a social and economic distance from hard-pressed rural whites, Tillman actively identified himself as an ally. Sometimes it even seemed that Tillman was the only commoner to be found, a stump-meeting opponent thinking that no white Democrat would willingly describe himself in the humble terms Tillman employed, asked anyone present who actually considered himself a common man to raise his hand. Only Tillman did so, but his gesture was received with what the Charleston News and Courier described as cheering and confusion. Tillman's willingness to identify himself in this way, even when others hesitated to make the same claim, may have made his pose even more credible. In this sense, at least, he was accurate in claiming to be organizing the common people against the aristocracy. If you haven't got generals and colonels and captains and gentlemen enough to fill the offices, he told an 1888 meeting, just pick up some common man and try him. He was willing to be that man and to present himself as the somewhat hapless victim of an overwhelming aristocratic retaliation. The opposition, he said, having first gently laid Captain Tillman down, heaps a whole pile of honorables upon him, topped off with a governor. How is one poor little farmer who is only a captain in the militia to get from under such a terrible weight? The captain of the militia, suitably belittled by disdainful opponents, could indeed seem to be a poor little farmer. The attacks on Tillman and his supporters in the 1890 campaign demonstrated that his opponents had learned nothing when it came to the political tactics, as white farmers from across the state assembled in Columbia for the March 1890 Shell Convention. Crowds of students from the University of South Carolina greeted them with disdainful jeers and choruses of, "We'll hang Ben Tillman from a sour apple tree." To Tillman, this proved that the Columbia School teaches the aristocratic right that those boys are the inheritors of power. Towns agreed that the demonstration was evidence of the insolence and confidence of long-continued power. While the students mocked the hayseeds, the instigators of the demonstration sat by their comfortable fires in their elegantly furnished rooms with slippered feet and robed in costly dressing gowns. This was how they spent their energies in trying to keep the farmers down. The aristocrats not only refused to acknowledge Tillman's movement as a legitimate successor to the red shirts, but also depicted it as a dangerous exercise in demagoguery. From the beginning, skeptical observers had worried about Tillman's invocation of the red shirt legacy. As Tillman began to make a name for himself in 1886, a PD newspaper declared that the time for bulldozing and bluster in South Carolina is past. The upcoming election would pit Democrat against Democrat, white man against white man. Red shirt force and threat had no place in such a contest, and it would be foolish for any man to think he can carry an election by storm. The people have been taught to think and act for themselves, and we cannot conceive how any white man can be cheated out of their right to vote as they please by blustering people who wish to exhibit what they consider their strength. But such protestations revealed a profound undercurrent of anxiety about the power of storm and bluster to undermine men's capacity for responsible political action. To opponents, Tillman's agitation constituted rank demagoguery that threatened to reduce the state to revolution, anarchy, or mob rule. The Charleston News and Courier charged that Tillman appealed to the passions and prejudices of the ignorant. Prominent Democratic leader F.W. McMaster accused Tillmanites of attempting to incite the poor against the rich to make men believe our state has been governed by a heartless oligarchy and political rings. And if an argument cannot be answered, the mob is incited to cry out the opprobrious term ringsters with shameless arrogance and falsehood. Many of our farmers, good, true, and simple-minded men, have been seduced by the wily teachings of this prince of humbugs and shut their eyes to argument and blindly followed their leader to their injury. Tillman and alliance activists set class against class. At every meeting, Tillman opponents claimed men uttered base and slanderous sentiments such as, "It is the poor against the rich." Just like it was in the war, the poor men had to do all the fighting and the rich men stayed at home. Others described Tillman's supporters as using the terms of European radicalism. The farmers' movement complained a former governor absorbed and carried along the sans culotts and anarchical element which has always existed. The author of a letter to the News and Courier agreed that the reform movement aims at the destruction of law and order. It is a red revolution fit for the days of Marat and the sans culottes. Opponents frequently portrayed Tillman's supporters as illiterate rowdies. Barnwell conservative Alfred Aldrich complained of Tillman toughs, my name for them. Mobs, blind men, victims of seduction, anarchists, those who followed Tillman deserve to be described in such uncitizen-like terms. Tillmanites spit the language of their enemies back at them. By the farmers, by them, the farmers are named sans-culottes, a term of reproach applied in monarchies to the most abject and degraded people, wrote Townies in a pamphlet pointedly entitled "Don't You Forget It." The farmers are called deserters and tools of Tillman and other Opprobrious names, such as heretofore, have only been used by the most vulgar fishwoman. Every farmer and every man in the state who respects honest toil, he said, should unite as one man to put down this debasing method of political warfare. We trust the day is not distant when the farmer will command as much respect and receive as decent treatment in Columbia as a patent medicine faker or a circus clown. The Democratic leadership was not so caught up in its denunciations that its members failed to recognize the Tillmanites' organizational methods. They complained bitterly about the Farmers Association practice of meeting just prior to Democratic assemblies in order to agree on farmers' candidates. As early as 1886, opponents protested that farmers' movement tickets and resolutions had been forced upon the convention by this preconcerted action of delegates from the country. Some perceive a desire on the part of some of the farmers to come in and capture our county Democratic convention in Chesterfield. The farmers showed no disposition to rule, but in Marlborough, the farmer element prevailed and carried nearly everything in its way. The Farmers' Convention of March 1890 represented the culmination of this strategy. The night before it began, Tillman met with a caucus of delegates to plan strategy, and the convention itself started by hitting all the important notes: a pledge to respect Anglo-Saxon unity, a call for primaries and reapportionment, and invocations to the legacy of 1876. When it came time to suggest a nominee for governor, J.L.M. placed Tillman's name in nomination, declaring shame on the party for stabbing Gary, a man who had saved in us in 76. We could now make the amends honorable and choose B.R. Tillman. Opponents had also recognized the potential power of such a suggestion and had mobilized to prevent it, joining local farmers, clubs, and finding like-minded skepticism in them. Anti-Tillman Democrats almost succeeded in preventing the convention from putting forward a farmer's candidate. Indeed, opponents actually may have won. The vote on whether to make a suggestion passed only by a tiny margin, and on a recount they may not have been entirely honest. Such a dubious victory, however, was in keeping with the red shirt legacy, for since the 1870s, insurgent Democrats had always relied on a combination of careful organizing and brazen fraud. In the months that followed the March convention, Tillman parlayed his narrow victory into a full-blown campaign for the Democratic nomination. He told his supporters not to organize separate Tillman clubs, but to attack the regular forces, the machinery that controls those Democratic conventions, to do your bidding, whether it is for me or for any other man. Some seem to believe that only certain men possess the crucial qualities of leadership and authority. Wounded by the Shell Manifesto's attack on the state's historic leaders, the Charleston News and Courier sniffed that there was and is an aristocracy in South Carolina, an aristocracy of brains and character. The anti-Tillman conservative faction of the Democratic Party, the paper later wrote, embraces nearly all the wealthiest, best educated, and consequently most intelligent people in every county. Conservatives began searching for an alternative candidate. Powerful Democrats such as Johnson, Haygood, and Governor Richardson, barred by law from a third term, who saw incipient dissolution and consequent disaster in a Tillman victory, sought a candidate of wisdom, conservatism, and moderation and strict equity. Their efforts were in vain. That summer, as Tillman and two rivals exchanged speeches before crowds throughout the state, local Democratic clubs and county conventions prepared to nominate delegates to the September state nominating convention. But Tillman seemed to have the organizational upper hand. At the end of the canvass, the largely anti-Tillman State Democratic Executive Committee decided that its only hope of preventing Tillman nomination lay in holding a primary in which anti-Tillman forces would unite behind one candidate. They planned to use the August convention to change the party's rules and call a primary before the September nominating convention. Otherwise, control of the composition of that convention would rest with delegates to the county conventions who were elected by local Democratic clubs. Given Tillman's ability to muster support at this level of Democratic politics, retaining the old rules would probably mean ceding the nomination to him. The Charleston News and Courier warned that this would lead to a split in the party, for in its estimation, regular Democrats cannot support Captain Tillman if he should be nominated as long as he let stand his charges against the Democratic Party and its current leaders. The paper also urged the formation of anti-Tillman Democratic clubs in every election district. But as the election drew nearer, a concerned Democrat suggested that it would be just as well not to talk of a split or seceders, etc., and not to assume too much the existence of a condition which really does not yet exist. Assuming a thing very often forces men to act. Assuming a separation in the party may do more to make men feel themselves committed to it and bring it about than anything else. As it turned out, the crisis came at the August convention. Tillmanites quickly gained parliamentary control of the body, overrode the executive committee, and placed responsibility for selecting nominating convention delegates in the hands of the county conventions. They elected a new executive committee under a new party constitution that called for a statewide primary beginning in 1892. Outraged anti-Tillmanites from the Low Country and Columbia left the hall to form a rump convention. Their leader was Richland Democratic boss Alexander Haskell, who had been at the forefront of the anti-Tillman movement since the spring. Anti-Tillmanites denounced the August convention's adoption of a new party constitution as improper or even illegal. But the pro-Tillman Greenville News responded that such protests were as useless as reading Supreme Court decisions to a lynching party clamoring furiously at the door of a jail. The Tillmanites' seizure of the party machinery, the news suggested, represented the welling up of the spirit of 1876. Once white men had mobilized to seize the day, no force could be expected to stop them. This provided opponents with a rhetorical opening, a way to distinguish between right and might. It is not only a sensible and timely action to read the law to a lynching party, responded a Charleston News and Courier editorial, but it is a duty of the respecters and representatives of the law to do so, and unless the Greenville newspaper is prepared to maintain that the illegal actions of a lynching party is made legal, becomes a law when done by a power too strong to be resisted and should not therefore be condemned or criticized afterward, it cannot, we think, justify its position relative to the willful and violent course of the wrongdoers. The lynching party in the August convention, Tillman and his men had lynched democracy. From Mahoneism to aristocratic rebellion, anti-Tillmanites, often known simply as antis, continued to insist that they were the legitimate inheritors of the mantle of 1876. Indeed, they had the chutzpah to call themselves straight-outs, and as the 1890 election approached, they even suggested that Tillman's support for the alliancemen and old greenbackers portended a renewed black and white independent coalition like that of William Mahone's Virginia Readjuster Party. According to one hostile observer, every man in Orangeburg County who ever voted or favored a greenback or independent ticket or movement is now a hot Tillman man. The Negroes and Republicans see Mahone and Virginia in the near future. Some Democrats had long worried that some bad or unprincipled citizen taking hold of some popular movement would organize an independent challenge that would draw on Republican support. We should think of the fearsome results that will be sure to follow. Mahoneism, under whatever name, urged one anti-Tillmanite on the eve of the Shell Convention. Although these opponents probably did not believe their own charges, it was true that former greenbackers had nowhere else to turn. Despite Tillman's clear commitment to white supremacy and democratic rule, his farmers' movement offered Republicans and independents their only hope for a breakup of the Redemption-era Democratic Party. Between 1886 and 1890, W.W. Russell took part in county and state-level conventions of the movement, and for a time, Tillman even captured the imagination of J. Hendricks McLean. In an 1886 speech before his stalwarts at a local grange, McLean endorsed Tillman as a worthy successor in fighting the Redeemer Bourbons. The members of this grange since 1878 had been where Mr. B.R. Tillman of Edgefield now stands. McLean declared he is aiming for the same port for which years ago you set sail. Like Tillman, McLean believed that even honest farmers who became legislators could be stymied and corrupted by bourbon institutions. And like Tillman, McLean reached back to the campaign of 1876 as the model for a new farmers' liberation movement. He depicted Reconstruction as a struggle of the farmers and other honest taxpayers against the rule of the stranger and Bourbon lawyer elements that only claimed the name Democrat. 4 short years after his coalition went down in defeat, McLean spoke the Tillmanite vernacular of redemption, challenging neither its violence and fraud, its implications of racialized manhood, nor its elision of class distinction among white farmers. McLean's allies likewise sympathetically compared Tillman's and McLean's speeches, suggesting that many former Greenbacker believed Tillman might be a worthy or at least electable successor. Clarity would come, though not soon enough. By 1889, McLean himself became a reform Republican and returned to South Carolina several times in an effort to re-establish the state party on an interracial basis. McLean's old coalition partners had pursued a variety of political courses since the early 1880s. Some voted for Low Country fusion tickets, and many continued to imagine a renewed independent coalition. White Republican leader Ellery M. Brayton had prayed in 1889 that someone among those at heart in the rebellion amongst the fraud-marked, ring-ruled, and blood-stained Bourbon organization would act as the bold, brave, and wise Mahone did. But especially after the election of Republican Benjamin Harrison to the presidency in 1888, many more placed their hopes in federal action and supported congressional efforts to pass the Lodge Elections Bill. This legislation, which would have allowed local political minorities to call for federal oversight of elections, was referred to by hostile Democrats as the Force Bill. Although the bill never became law, to Democrats, it represented Republicans' continued determination to use federal power to return the South to Reconstruction. In 1891, Tillman warned that the Force Bill was an attempt to reconstruct us, to make the pyramid stand on its apex, and give us back again the Negro as a ruler. The defeated Redeemers could not have said it better, and radical alliancemen who wanted to remain Democrats could not say anything at all.
Context of White Supremacy. Gus T Renegade. We are stopping on page 141. We'll pick up on the final paragraph on page 141. For folks who would like to chime in, the number to dial is 760-569-7676. The code 564943 pound. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. That number again is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564943 pound. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. For folks who would like to use the free flash phone, it should be linked at Black Talk Radio Network. The address, if you need it, tiny, TINY.cc/1race. And that is the number 1. Address again, tiny, TINY.cc/1race. And that is the number 1. When you put in the address, you'll see 3 lines, or actually when you put in the address, click the link on the left side. It says free flash phone. Click that link. It should open a tiny window on your screen. It'll be 3 lines. The top line
It is a drop-down menu. Select the number that I just gave out, which again is 760-569-7676. You'll see that number selected. The next line, it will ask for the code. That code again is 564943. Final line, it'll ask for a name. You can, click random keys, nickname, whatever. If you feel comfortable with your real name, that's fine too. Go ahead, once you get all that entered, click the green button at the bottom. It will connect you to the program. And it is the same procedure. If you would like to speak, you'll see the dial pad on your screen. Press *6. And you should hear an audio prompt. Press the number 1 and I'll get your hand. We will get you on the line. I do want to reiterate, we started off this week, the audio segment was the statement from Clemson that came out last week, like I said, just a few hours before we went live, and I think that is so significant, the precise wording that they had to offer around their supposed denouncing of Ben Tillman. But they said, I want to read that sentence again, and just, if you all can tell me if I'm, talking crazy or if this doesn't make sense or what have you, feel free. But I just think that this is, this is major. Like, I would be very curious to know, like, just to get them to explain, to see, to make sure that I'm reading this correctly. But they said, for some members of our university family, Benjamin Tillman's legacy included not only contributions to Clemson University, but also oppression, terror, and hate. So by what they're saying, that would suggest that some members of the University of Clemson family, their legacy of Ben Tillman does not include oppression, terror, and hate. That's what the statement suggests to me. I would just like clarification about that. And if so, those people are, what exactly do they mean? Like, are they saying that he didn't do these things? Are they saying that he didn't participate in these murders? Are they saying he didn't brag about killing black people? Are they saying that he was not a proud, unabashed defender of white terrorism? I mean, what are these people saying exactly? And who are these people? Can we get their names, address, like the whole game? Are they currently employed at the university? Like, let's get, I would need a lot of detail to clarify that statement. Unless I'm crazy, feel free, but I think that is huge. Anywho, everybody who dialed in with a hand up, your line is open, and I do think it is hugely significant for context. I am on vacation. One thing that I have learned, next time I'm on vacation, we will be like on vacation, no programs on vacation. But we are here. I'm ready to roll, notes and all. But we are on vacation, so that is why you can hear probably a lot of festive things in the background, because we are on vacation, but ready to roll nonetheless. Everybody who dialed in with a hand up, your line should be open. Thomas in New York should be with us. Mr. Demery, you are with us as well.
Greetings. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes, greetings, Gus, and greetings to the other callers and listeners. Demery Ford here. I'd like to start off with that we are all victims, whether we know it or not. This book, if we can get anything out of reading it, should help us to avoid further victimization, participating in our own victimization, or even worse, paying for our own victimization, by not understanding the system of white supremacy. Okay, Bill Tillman spoke about farmers not becoming slaves when he himself had a part in enslaving Africans. On page 122, that was part of his rhetoric to talk to the farmers and produce fear, I guess, in them that they could become slaves, like they had already treated the Africans earlier. And the hypocrisy of almost everything that he says, he's projecting these ideas, that are in direct opposition with actually what he believes in. It's interesting that the poor white folk and the poor farmers would react favorably towards a wealthy landowner. But they could all agree upon one thing, and that's torturing and killing black people. It's interesting, too, that right before he became governor, he was about to quit politics, I guess, and then he got this infusion of energy when John Calhoun died, and his son-in-law, Clemson, decided to, fund this vision of a school that he had, and that would be Clemson. So Tillman was using a grassroots movement approach, like we see today with politicians, where they try to identify with the poor or the downtrodden, and then make these promises and don't ever plan to do anything. And what I noticed too is they keep referring to the victory in 1876, when they were terrorizing black politicians and assassinating and murdering them and running them out of office with terror. They're proud of that, and he keeps referring to that. And on page 131, Tillman called himself a plain and blunt man. He was doing all this to identify, with the plain people, I guess. But it says he set a low priority on factual accuracy or consistency. So over and over he charged opponents with conspiracy, corruption, and incompetency, only to retreat when challenged, declaring that he had not meant to impugn any particular individual. This guy is just a hypocrite of the highest degree. And he used his political enemies to gain support. And it looks as though the media, the Charleston News, Carrier, and the Greenville News were aiding in spreading Tillman's ideology. And I have a few more comments, but I'll reserve them for later. Thanks for taking the call, Bill.
For sure, Mr. Demery. I hope you and your family are taking care and healing spiritually, and definitely thoughts still with your mother-in-law. Mr. Thomas Smith in New York, did you have commentary?
Oh, Gus, not right now. I'll comment on the second one. I'm not able to speak right now.
Oh, right on. Any of the other folks, if you have commentary, feel free. Man, oh man, I was cracking up laughing for so many reasons this week. Just reading this section, I think this has easily been the most entertaining section for me. And some of this didn't even come through until I was reading it for the second time. Just reading, going over the second time. But I keep in mind, right? This, I think a listener asked early on, it was maybe the first or second week when we started this book. They said, Gus, do you think they're going to take the statues down, playing overhead? But they said, Gus, do you think they're going to take the statues down? And I said, I don't think so. There had been white people who had kind of said from the very beginning of all of this that, we will concede the Confederate flag, but we are not giving an inch on anything else. Don't even get started with anything else. Removal of any other statues, monuments, shrines, nothing. It's not even, we're not even having a conversation about it, so get that out your mind right now. And so I said, I think it's probably safe. You might have to stay tuned, but I think I said it's probably safe. The university reiterated, oh yeah, it's not coming down. And further, we can't even take it down. This would require a vote. The state, the House and the South Carolina House and Senate, same procedure that they did with the flag, they would have to vote. And I think it's a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate. That's what would be required. And then I think the governor would have to sign off on that too. That's what would be required for Tillman Hall to be changed to something else. So it's not going to change like at Clemson, and I think that would go for Winthrop because these are public institutions, right? So I think this would apply across the board, and the monument that's at the state capitol that I've had up. So I think all of them are going to be safe, and so I keep that in mind this week. I howled. I mean, not just the white supremacy. That's why we're reading the book. That's obvious. Let's put that aside for a moment. Just this is the guy that we have a statue for. Like, they are known for stealing, defrauding elections. That's what that's their legacy in the state of South Carolina. This guy has a statue. This is on page 131. It's okay. This is the bottom. This is, well, not quite the bottom, like the middle of 131. It says, pettier allegations, true and false, were brought to bear. By Tillman's second term as governor, hostile commentators would accuse him of turning Clemson into a dude factory, wearing kid gloves and dressing in style. Some charges might not have seemed so petty. One neighbor nursed a grievance against Tillman that echoed other white men's outrage at upper-class arrogance. Edgefield farmer J.C. Shaw wrote the new governor in 1891 that for years he had begged you, written you as a friend and gentleman to keep your wagons off my growing crops. Tillman had not complied, and now Shaw was forced to threaten him. Now, Mr. Tillman, will you tell me, what do you want? Is it trouble, or what is it? I do not go about you or anything you have. Now, if you are a man, for God's sake, I mean, not that I don't feel bad for this white guy, but I mean, this is the guy that has a statue. Like, you are trampling a poor white man's crops in South Carolina, a subsistence farmer trampling his crops to the point where he has to threaten you with violence. And this is the guy that we have to have like a massive vote and an order from the governor to take down his statues, in addition to terrorizing, torturing black people and bragging about doing so. That's just incredible. I also thought it was important when they were talking about Clemson on page 128, since they're not taking the statue down, which, yes, this is the top of 128. So as Mr. Demerfor already said, so they get this big infusion. He was almost out of politics, and this is like this gave him his second wind. And so Tillman and 6 other men were to be named life trustees of the college. These men would make up more than half the college's board and would have the power to name their successors. Tillman later stated that this provision was intended to keep any future radical government from admitting black students. Now, I mean, it's just, to me, it's so blatant why he has these statues, why he is so important to the history of South Carolina, to the history of white terrorism. It's nothing about this guy's legacy that is, this is not an honorable person. Like, even if we put the racism aside, like, there's nothing. This guy's a liar. Like, they're saying women were warned about coming to hear his speeches because he's so lewd and vulgar. I mean,
What is there that is respectable about this guy? What is it that you would say, yeah, this is something that we want to pass on to future generations? This is behavior that we want to make sure is modeled for centuries. There is absolutely nothing but the religion of white supremacy. And I'd have to say it for sure that way, because they talk, I mean, this is Moses. They talk about him in biblical terms. And he is Moses, and it's tied to white supremacy, that white people, again, were somehow enslaved under Negro domination of Reconstruction. And he led them out of this through sheer terror and violence and brutality and murder of black people, including participating and promoting an environment where state representatives are being killed, just like State Representative Clementa Pinckney. I think it's just fascinating on a number of levels. I checked a lot of other things. I can only say this. I hope for me it really, really clarifies what it means to be white and how every single thing, like when Mr. Fuller gives the metaphor, and it is a metaphor. Wow, there were some interesting metaphors this week in this section too. But when Mr. Fuller gives that metaphor about the grain of sand, white people go down and will study a grain of sand and figure out how to use it to dominate you. I mean, really, everything about the way white people function, everything about the way that they construct their environments, what's important, who they think is important, who gets buildings named after them and what have you. All of that, everything is about reifying white terrorism and domination of black people. Everything. I mean, that is dedication, where a person like this, who, yeah, okay, maybe he might have mistreated some other white people. Yeah, okay, maybe he was a habitual liar. He would just make up allegations about other white people. Like, yeah, he killed some niggers. Okay. But man, he was stout and unabashed, a soldier in the army of white supremacy. Absolutely. We're here. Tillman Hall forever. Tillman Hall. I mean, that's what, to me, it clarifies so much about what it means to be white. And this is the way I process what happened, the predictability of Dylann Roof. This is the way that white people, they honor Dylann Roofs. That's their whole history. I will hit my mute there. Caller, I think this might be Shadow. Maybe I'm incorrect. Should be with us as well. Did you have commentary?
Yes, this is Shadow. How you doing?
Right poorly. I'm on vacation, actually. I'm not right poorly today.
That's right. Yes, I just finished the book myself, and you're right. As I read through it, I feel like this book gives a clearer picture of what it means to be white than almost anything I can remember reading. And it really explains the politics of today, even though we're talking about somebody that was alive shortly after the Civil War and died in, I think, 1920 or so, I forget. But yeah, it's his legacy and the fact that they still want to keep that statue up. It does say a lot. It says a lot about who they are and what they honor and who they respect. And I think this is definitely a book. It's hard to recommend a book like this for people to read, but I'm going to try as much as I can to get more people to read it, especially if you're from the South or South Carolina.
Yeah, it should be.
That's it for me.
It should be mandatory reading. If you're a black person and you live in South Carolina, it should be mandatory reading. If you're a black person and you are an alumni of Clemson or Winthrop, it should be mandatory reading. If you went to school, period, in the state of South Carolina, it should be mandatory reading. I think.
Absolutely.
And I mean, just you'll learn. I mean, it's not. I don't think it's the best written book, and I don't think it's like the most enjoyable read. But in terms of just giving, like I said, one of the things I've repeated over and over again, it's rare in this day and age where you got Timothy Wise and Dr. Peggy McIntosh and Dr. Robin DiAngelo and, you know, all of these white wordsmiths, and they got their buckets of words and everything. It's rare to have this type of crystal clarity where they make it unabashed, they make it clear. We are about white supremacy, and they are saying white supremacy. I mean, sometimes I'm even when I am reading and when I hear myself reading this, and they're saying white supremacy, and it's in quotes. It's not even the author, Stephen Kantrowitz, who is a white man, likely race soldier. It's not even him saying it. This is in quotes. Like, they were saying this specifically. The bond of white supremacy, like, is so rare. And for me, it's so refreshing to just hear that type of clarity and to see it across the board. Like, to just see that, in my opinion, he could have made it clear if he's a guest on the program, the author, Mr. Kantrowitz, and he said he would be down to do so once he's back in the country. But in my view, it could have been made clearer that there was no dispute amongst white people, rich, poor, landowner, merchant, renter, whatever the case may be. It was unanimous about domination over black people. That was one thing where, hey, okay, we're all on the same page about that. Even some of the white people who are allegedly Republicans and allegedly with black people, even those people, a lot of times with suspicion, and even he quotes some of the black people saying that in the book. But that's one thing that I think he could have made clearer. And I'll raise that point with him. Anybody else have other thoughts they wanted to share? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I just, and one of the things that I remember reading was him saying that, you know, that either black people had to be under the heel of white men or they had to be dead. There was no, I mean, just like you said, this is unfiltered. This is what it's about. Slaves or dead, or at least subordinate.
That's pretty.
I mean, yes. Any confusion?
Right on. Tillman Hall. Right on. That's incredible. That's what I mean. That's the sort of thing where I am totally for keeping it named Tillman Hall. Like, as long as the system of white supremacy exists, it should be named Tillman Hall. Like, you should name the whole university Tillman University. Change Clemson, Winthrop, call it, Tillman 1 and 2 or whatever, however you need to distinguish it. But I think that should just be made clear so that every black person, every non-white person who is a student, faculty member, whatever you do, landscaper, window cleaner, you know exactly who this person is. There's no ambiguity. I'm fully aware of this person's legacy, and I can come to my own conclusions about this person being honored on this campus and throughout the state of South Carolina. But I'm all for keeping it. That's why we're reading this book. I also thought on, let's see, this is on page 122. I thought this was a great passage that revealed why he has this statue. The issue at stake was collective rights, not individual reputations. Ransom's challenge was the act of a Hessian, a mercenary in the service of the state leadership, and it demanded a collective rather than a personal response. Tillman's poverty-stricken, debt-enslaved, tax-ridden farmers are organizing from the mountains to the sea to take on the Columbia ring that had set Ransom against him. Tillman was interested not in exchanging pistol shots, but in defining and mobilizing white manhood. I thought that right there, that's another just great sentence that explains why he has all of the shrines and monuments throughout the state of South Carolina, mobilizing white manhood, and from the very important section from last week where he talked about the importance of having a state college for white women. I think that as well. I think he had them in his mind as well, knowing their essential role in the system of white terrorism. Let's see, on page... I thought it was also significant. This is on 122, where they continue to use these metaphors and analogies that if you are a white person and you violate the white code, you're a black person. And I mean, you hear that sort of, I hear that sort of thing today when white people, when they want to impugn your character or somehow suggesting that you are no longer a white person. I think they did that somewhat with John Boehner when they want to get at him because they'll go at his complexion. Dr. Welsing talks about that all the time. There are some other examples I'm sure I could think of if you gave me enough time. But the section, it pops up over and over again in the book where the people that are criticizing the folks that are voting and supporters of Ben Tillman, where they get criticized and compared to black people that are ignorant and don't know that the person that they're voting for and supporting doesn't care about them at all. It popped up on page, for me, this is on 133. Yeah, this is on 133, where he says, oh, that's the one I already had. It pops up again on 122. Organize or remain slaves. In Tillman's rhetoric, slavery functioned as a present symbol as well as a historical memory, where he's comparing somehow again white people have been, even the metaphor with Tillman being compared to Moses, that he is leading white people out of slavery. That's, with the way that they're talking about Reconstruction and being under Negro domination, as they called it. It's popped up several other times. It's not the only time this week. Their whiteness is impugned, and also their manhood is impugned. He does that several times, where he compares, said he would rather hit a woman than to hit this ransom fella that he's having a dispute with. He does that again further down. This is at the bottom of 122. He says, if there are any Miss Nancys among you who are afraid to exercise your rights as citizens and taxpayers to discuss these and other questions so vital to our interests, you had as well as withdraw. It seems like that's a constant aspect of the rhetoric, the jargon, these rhetorical attacks to impugn the whiteness of an individual who has committed a violation or has done something wrong, and or to impugn their manhood, sometimes altogether. Also, I would think this guy should also be classified as a sexist as well. I don't know why you wouldn't have a lot of white women also who would be upset. Like, why would you want this, sexist white patriarch to have a statue? I have not seen that thus far. Maybe I just, haven't paid close enough attention. Caller in Florida, you should be with us as well. Did you have commentary? Oops, sorry, I think I missed. There you go. Did you have commentary, sir?
No, sir. I just happened to tune in, so I guess I'll have to wait till the second reading to make comments.
Uncle Dope. Right on. No problem. Let's see.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir. Go right ahead.
Okay, I wanted to make a comment about page 131. Tillman had been attacking the crop lien system, and he was calling to repeal the lien law. But then, 1890 campaign, one legislator claimed that several years before, Tillman had asked him to help repeal the lien law, when he had refused on the grounds that it would deprive the poor white constituents of the credit they needed to raise crops. Tillman had supposedly replied, well, put them to work for wages, and you can control them. See, this guy, the very thing that he said he was fighting for, then when he was asked about it, he just throws them under the bus. I'll just put them to work for wages. They'll be all right. And also on page 141, talking about the force bill. Let me see if I can. Oh, yeah. Okay, although the bill never became law, the Democrats, it represented Republicans' continued determination to use federal power to return the South to Reconstruction. In 1891, Tillman warned that the force bill was an attempt to reconstruct us, to make the pyramid stand on its apex and give us back, again, the Negro as ruler. I think you had already mentioned that, Gus, but that was another note that I had made. I'll mute my line.
I mean, that's just, it's fascinating. It's so many of these just great passages. Like anybody, I think if you write, if you have a blog, or if you, I think even if you are like an instructor, if you're a teacher, I know we have some of those educators. I think this book has some great passages. I know if I lived in South Carolina, if I had children, if I was an uncle, if I was an aunt, if I was an educator, if I had access to black children, or maybe even some older black people, I would for sure have some passages from this book to share with them, just so, you know, they can get a better understanding of the world in which we live, particularly now, since I think they might be more receptive given everything that's, you know, all the attention on South Carolina for the time being. I also, on page, and if you have any other comments, we have maybe 20 minutes before we get to the second audio segment. We might go a little quicker if nobody has things they want to share. Also thought it was significant on page 120, 124. And if anybody, and this is throughout, if any of the passages, if you think it's significant that a white person wrote this, that it could be an act of racism, the way something is worded, said, you know, feel free, always be on the alert for that. On 124, let's see. Oh, okay. Okay, so where he says at times, wait a minute, make sure I get the right one here. Miss Nancy's, I'm looking for this metaphor he has specifically about someone trying to use black voters. I thought I had it highlighted here. Maybe I'm just off the page. Anywho, the metaphor that he gives about being tempted to go after black voters, he compares it to the devil is always tempting. And I said to the religion of white supremacy, if racist man and racist woman, if they are gods, of course, if the religion does, most religions have a devil figure of some sort, then of course the black person is going to be the devil. And I think, didn't they say that about Michael Brown, that he was a demon of some sort? I can't believe I can't find the passage here so I can read it exactly. Miss Nancy's, the type on this book is, or I wouldn't say the type, it's just the pages. These pages have a lot of words in comparison to most of the books. The pages, it has a lot of content per page, in my view. Yeah, I'm struggling to find it. I'll get it in a second. That was on page 124. I'll get the exact wording in a second. I also thought on page 126, where they talked about these groups of, I was on the wrong page. That was why I thought I was, I'm going crazy. So on 126, I'm moving past the metaphor, but on 126, I also thought it was great when they explained that all of this was not spontaneous, that this was well thought out, well planned, that Ben Tillman was not ignorant, that he was well informed about how to mobilize and organize white people and to get white farmers in particular, to get them together, that this was not something that was just happenstance or what have you, that this was well-organized machinery that took place, not ignorance. I thought that was super important. So I would even say that this is predictable behavior on the part of white people in terms of them organizing, particularly if there's some sense of white people are aggrieved or some threat, real or imagined, of Negro insurrection, non-white insurrection, non-white threat of some sort, on page 126, where they talked about that, or just the fact that this wasn't spontaneous. Let's see if I had any other notes that stood out. Got the devil, spontaneous. The Moses, I pointed that out as well. Religion of white supremacy, relying on these biblical metaphors, in the way that, that they're talking about racism, white supremacy. I think they mentioned before that after the end of the Civil War
and the end of so-called formal plantation slavery. The white people said it affected their religion. They went through almost all the areas of people activity. It's been mentioned repeatedly throughout the book. It's been talked about in religious terms, the practice of white supremacy. Even, I think they said they had an invocation of 1876 when they were torturing and massacring black people, including elected officials. That right there, the religion of white terrorism, and again, the ritual sacrifice of black people when they're talking about it in those terms, in my opinion. Let's see. Got that on 126. 128, I got that. 131. Yeah, I thought it was interesting, them referring to some of the white people who were following Tillman, referring to them as ignorant black people, which, again, I'm going to pay attention to that metaphor as we continue to read how frequently when a white person is judged to be doing something incorrect, somehow they have lost or impugned, tainted their whiteness, to see how consistent that is. Also think it's important, too, I think the relationship or the importance of the media, where so much of this is playing out in the press, where people are being quoted, what they're saying. Ben Tillman being shrewd enough to develop relationships with journalists so that he has access to promote his views and to build his brand on his way to the governorship. The importance of journalism, super important. Reading the paper, he's even going back and reading even not just what was in the newspaper today can be important, but what was in the newspaper 150 years ago can be important at times. Any other comments before we get to the second audio? Anybody else have anything they want to share?
Yes, I would like to comment on your statement about, white people charging other white people's manhood, of whether or not you're on the white team or not, and I think that may be why we see a lot of these racist rants sometimes from celebrities and other people that's well known, because they have to make sure that they choose sides. For some reason or another, it's been challenged, and they have to make a statement. That's just my view. I could be wrong. But on page 139, like I said, the media seemed that they were on Tillman's side, but it said anti-Tillmanites denounced the August Convention adoption of a new party constitution as improper or even illegal. But pro-Tillman Greenville News responded that such protesters were as useless as reading Supreme Court decision through a lynching party, clamoring furiously at the door of a jail. I think that the author choosing that particular metaphor or statement may be an act of racism. I'll mute my line.
Absolutely. That whole paragraph is incredible, in my opinion. That's another one where I was like, this is the guy who has a statue. Number one, to your point, I absolutely think that metaphor is a total statement of white terrorism, because it's like, well, once, white people have come to lynch a nigger, I mean, we can't really, spend a whole lot of time talking about what the legal code is at that point. I mean, what are you going to do? I mean, that is total support of racism, white supremacy. And I thought it was even more interesting that exactly where Mr. Demery stopped at, the Tillmanite seizure of the party machinery, the news suggested, represented the welling up of the spirit of 1876, which again is just invoking the spirit, the religion of white terrorism. Once the white men had mobilized to seize the day, no force could be expected to... I mean, wow. This provided opponents with a rhetorical opening, a way to distinguish between right and might. It is not only a sensible and timely action to read the law to a lynching party, responded a Charleston News and Courier editorial, but it is the duty of the the respecters and representatives of the law to do so. And unless the Greenville News is prepared to maintain that the illegal actions of a lynching party is made legal becomes a law when done by a power too strong to be resisted and should not therefore be condemned or criticized afterward. It cannot, we think, justify its position relative to the willful and violent course of the wrongdoers, the lynching party, in the August Convention. That's all in quotes. That is, in my view, like, wow, accurate, right to the point, like, excellent. The whole paragraph ends, Tillman and his men had lynched democracy, literally and figuratively, which was their whole history. He says that repeatedly. That's their whole history, stealing electoral fraud. You hear all this about voter ID and everything. I think South Carolina might have even been in that, having voter restrictions and what have you. That's the whole legacy of a man who, one of the co-founders of two of their flagship institutions, is a notorious political fraud. Behind notorious political fraud, put it that way. Fascinating read. Fascinating read. Any other comments before we get to the second audio? You're a little low. Can you speak up?
Yes. Quick comment. I didn't get a chance to listen to the first audio segment. I was still on the plantation, so I was just listening to the comments. That's why I said I'll comment on the second one. But from what I heard, man, if I could bring someone back today, man, I would bring back Mr. Tillman. And you probably flip when you see Obama in the White House, the Democratic Party today. You probably be like, oh, my God, what happened? Well, that's what I was thinking as you was reading. But, man, I can't wait to, you put this in the archive so I can hear the first part. But I'm definitely going to listen to the second part.
Absolutely. I was curious as we roll along if that was confusing anybody. The fact that it's kind of the reverse of what we see today, where the party that is associated with black people in this book is the Republicans, and that's obviously the opposite of what it is today. If that was confusing anybody, if anything, for me, it is helpful to show that all of this is nonsense, and it could switch around again tomorrow if racists so choose that all of these parties support the system of racism, white supremacy. Yeah, that passage is incredible for a lot of reasons. Let's see. Anything else? 131. 28.
On page 140, they talk about, excuse me, they talk about Grange, the Grange. The members of this Grange since 1878 have been where Mr. B.R. Tillman of Edgefield now stands. Those Granges are still present today. You can look them up. They have a national Grange Association. So it's not that this stuff it was like 150 years ago, but a lot of the same concepts, tactics, and strategies are being used today. I'll mute my line.
Absolutely. I'm not surprised about that at all. White people really have a great reverence for legacies of guns, white people and guns and violence, and keeping those clubs and what have you going, and even making new ones. I think Charles Todd, he was a guest on our program kind of the end of last year. He was talking about these young groups of college campuses. These are like gun groups. They would go out and shoot and what have you, go to the gun range. And a lot of them expressed a lot of the same thoughts as Ben Tillman about fears of black people and got to defend themselves against Negro aggression. And the Washington Post just had another article this year about some groups in the Washington, D.C. area that were doing the same thing, organized and carrying all this out. They real long tradition of that. I did find the passage that I was looking at before, and the book does have some pictures if you have the hard copy of the book to check out that are mildly interesting. But the bottom of 124, he says, Tillman warned the editor. One ally, he said, had told him that our people are not going to submit to this kind of thing forever. Nothing but a political earthquake will bring this crowd to its senses. Of course, he went on, I do not share in any such thoughts, for I would never under any circumstances have anything to do with pulling down our democratic temple. Religion of white supremacy. He shared the same fear articulated by the Edgefield Advertiser in 1878 that a calamitous class division among white men would lead both sides to make an expedient alliance with the black majority. The devil is always tempting men to use the Negro vote to carry their end, and sooner or later it will become the balance of power between the rich feeling Bourbons and the poor feeling and more progressive among our people. I fear this. God grant I am mistaken. Religion of white supremacy. But yeah, I thought that metaphor was interesting, again, where black people are being associated with the devil, Satan, evil. That is consistent within the system of racism, white supremacy. And I would even think within that metaphor, it implies that white people would be the godly ones, that it would be white people who would be committing some sort of sin by going along and cooperating with Negroes, even if they're using them to their own ends. Let's see. Even the other metaphor I forgot, when he went to the college, I think it was the University of South Carolina, he went there and they were not supporters and they jeered him and they said, we'll hang Ben Tillman from our sour apple tree. I said, again, it's like inability to process things in any other way other than white supremacy. Like, if you are not with me, if I am against you, you are no longer a white person. Your whiteness is what I have to attack. If I am in opposition to you, I have to do things and talk about you in a way that suggests that you are not a white person. So we're going to talk about lynching you the way that we do niggers. That is, to me, that is, unless I'm talking crazy. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Because I see that as a pattern in the book. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Gus, I had one question. When he calls the people progressive, was he talking about his party, or was he talking about progressives in the way that we normally speak of them now, when he talked about voting and using the black vote?
That is a good question, because I think that's one of those terms that can get, and depending on who you talk to, you might get a different answer. I think within this context, he might have meant anybody who is talking about any sort of deviation from what their particular brand of white supremacy within the Democratic Party at that time and the way that they wanted to practice it. So if you were someone who was talking about maybe trying to include black voters or making serious changes to the way that they were running things, because I think there's some major ideas about financial reforms, proposals coming up in the next segment. Any sort of disagreement with that, or certainly including black voters, I think just anything outside of that, you could end up being progressive or something perceived as a threat. But that's a good question.
Thank you.
Might not have been clear. Does anybody else have thoughts on that? What he might have meant when he talking about progressives from that section?
I got the impression that when he said progressives, that he was speaking about the farmers. Because everything that he said, it was rhetoric, but he was using reverse psychology, I think, and letting them feel that he was the best man for the job. Even when he turned down the governorship, it's almost like he wanted them to beg him to become the governor. So it just shows the deceptiveness, of white people, I think.
Absolutely. And I think too, I think there's also, because they kind of said that this guy, he enjoyed insulting people. I think white people know that that's something that you can really get a white person to suggest that they, you're a nigger, or you're behaving like a nigger, or you think like a nigger, or you're acting like a nigger. I think white people know that that's something that can really get you. And I think that continues on to today, a way that white people, when they want to insult another white person, wasn't it, I think Christina Aguilera, the commentator, where she said that she sung jigaboo music? Was that just like a few months back? Unless I'm talking crazy, I think that was just a few months back, right? Maybe I'm the only one who saw it. Anyway, I think it was a few weeks back. You can, search for it online or what have you and confirm. But I think white people do that on the regular when they're trying to insult other white people. And I think Ben Tillman, they said in the book, he relished the opportunity to get in these insults and what have you. And what better way to impugn someone else's character than to suggest that they are a black person. And I think a lot of white people still understand that to this day.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I got another good one.
Mm-hmm.
When the guy was challenging Bill Tillman, patriotism or whatever, saying he didn't go into war, and then he started talking about his eye and all this other stuff, about how he acted in 1876, keeping those niggers down or whatever, and then compare that to Donald Trump attacking McCain as a POW, and I thought that was an interesting comparison.
That is pretty good. Lots of it. I think somebody else had said Donald Trump was kind of behaving in a similar manner. They describe both of them as kind of being uncouth, real, just blunt, crude examples of racism, white supremacy. Dangerous nonetheless, no. Any other thoughts? Anything else folks want to make sure they're able to get in? Oh, it was Lady Gaga. Not Christina Aguilera. I mixed up my entertainers. But yeah, this was just earlier this year. News anchor got suspended for saying that Lady Gaga, she makes jigaboo music on air. Right on. I will assume everybody is good until we get to the second audio segment, or the conclusion of the second audio segment. Everybody good? Anything else they need to get in quickly? Grand. If you did have commentary, if you're listening in, you didn't get a hand up, just, jot a note, and we should have ample time for folks to share once the second segment concludes. We are picking up, we should be kind of the midway-ish point of 141, Ben Tillman and the Reconstruction of White Supremacy, audio segment number 2, Context of White Supremacy. At the local level, too, black South Carolinians continue to challenge the post-Reconstruction order. In 1886 through 1887, under the auspices of former Knights of Labor leader Hiram Hoover, widely misspelled Hoover, black farmer laborers mobilized as the Cooperative Workers of America in their effort to seek higher wages. Their labor movement elicited a predictably violent response. In the early summer of 1887, white farmers with shotguns forced black laborers in Greenville and other counties to renounce their affiliation with the organization. This did not put a stop to black agricultural protest. As white farmers joined the Farmers Alliance during the late 1880s, black agricultural workers formed chapters of parallel organizations, the Colored Farmers Alliance. We know less about the CFA than about its white counterpart, in part because its members performed much of their work in secret. The CFA shared many of the formal commitments of the Farmers Alliance and at times took part in National Alliance assemblies. It also supported cooperatives and other moves toward economic independence. But the CFA was primarily made up of black laborers, men whose interest in higher wages could set them directly against white landowners, including many of the leaders of the White Alliance. Despite the similarity of their organizations' names and constitutions, black and white alliance men regarded one another across a chasm of history and economic circumstance. The The CFA's members were primarily laborers and small renters, not owners and large renters as in the white organization. Although both black and white alliances stressed cooperative economics, black alliancemen also called for higher wages and lower rents, setting them in direct opposition to many of their white brethren, their landlords and employers. Moreover, many white alliancemen feared black political and economic independence as much as Tillman did. Even if their organizations had similar names, black laborers' agenda was quite different from that of white landowners. When an alliance business agent attacked the lien law, he complained that under its pernicious influence, every freedman in the land can pretend to run a farm, and consequently the control of the land and labor passes out of the hands of the owners. This argument needed little elaboration for an audience of landowners. When members of a black sub-alliance boycotted owners who enforced the stock law and threatened black farm workers who continued to work for such men, they were arrested. In Edgefield, a black alliance was said to have set a wage for cotton picking at 50 cents per 100 pounds and to be planning to fix rents as well. Such grassroots organization for economic betterment did not sit well with white men whose economic aspirations required subordinating both middlemen and laborers. The alliance, even among the colored people, is productive of good, noted the article reporting the stock law opponents' threats, but boycotting and mob law will not be allowed. White farmers acting collectively might claim the legacy of the red shirts, but when black farmers' organizations became mobilizations, they could seem to be part of a heritage that stretched back through the Cooperative Workers of America, the Reconstruction militias, and perhaps even antebellum slave conspiracies. McLean's efforts, the emergence of the CFA, and the proposed Lodge Bill together led some Democrats to suggest that Tillman planned to mobilize white and black alliances and create a new biracial independent movement. Tillman had indeed sought to solidify support among white alliancemen as part of his bid to take over the party, but anti-Tillmanites' accusations went much further than that, blaming any Republican activity, including attempts by black voters to register, on hopes raised by Tillman. They portrayed him as an unwitting tool of scheming Republicans and their front, the CFA. The Negro-crowded South Carolina concluded one editorial, "This is certainly not the time for divisions among the white people of the state." In fact, Tillman's position on black political activity could not have been clearer. Tillman boasted of his participation at the Hamburg and Ellington, and his 1890 running mate Eugene Gary made the protection of white prerogative against alleged black depredations the focus of his campaign. Pointing to technical education for blacks at Claflin College, which received $5,000 each year from the state, Gary urged giving white boys a comparable education so they could receive the wages earned by black mechanics. Gary also advocated the segregation of railroad cars, presenting black male sexuality as a threat to white women. What white man, Gary asks, wants his wife or sister sandwiched between a big bully buck and a saucy wench? I know every white woman in South Carolina will endorse segregated cars. Tillman's white opponents worried about being outflanked as proponents of this protective, manly white supremacy. An anti-Tillman Columbia audience responded to Gary's speech by shouting, "Come off that Tillman ticket. You ought to be with us." Although Tillman did not make Jim Crow legislation an important element of his campaign in 1890, his explanation for a separate car bill's defeat was that somebody got bamboozled by state railroad boss Bunch McBee. Segregation, it appeared, fit neatly into the program of the farmers' movement, and early advocates in the legislature included farmers' movement stalwarts Josh Ashley and Cole Blees. Despite Tillman's history and Gary's rhetoric, black alliancemen engaged in heated debate over the proper stance toward Tillman's campaign. One orator responded to Gary's attacks with his own statement of patriarchal authority and protection of black womanhood, declaring that if his wife was ever subjected to any indignity on the train, he would kill the man that attempted it. Others thought that Tillman's fight would ultimately benefit both black and white farmers, and that sooner or later The fight within the Democratic Party would make black votes a factor. The Black Alliance's state convention, however, refused to support either Democratic faction, although one black sub-alliance was reported to have endorsed the Shell Convention's suggestion of Tillman for governor, and at least one black Democrat wrote to Tillman claiming to have supported pro-Tillman delegates for the August convention. Although Tillman never gave any real encouragement to potential black supporters, his coalition was not a one unambiguous mind about black political participation. To be sure, Tillmanites attempted to allay fears that their movement would rally black voters. During the campaign, the Farmers State Alliance backed a motion by Tillman ally W.J. Talbert that the Lodge Bill should be defeated. But some Tillmanites privately suggested that the campaign attempt to control the Negro vote among Alliance Negroes were all our congressmen. Alliance President E.T. Stackhouse was confronted in early June with a document purporting to be a Marlborough County Black Sub-Alliance's endorsement of Tillman. Stackhouse, although uncertain whether the declaration is honest or not, reportedly commented that if they are honest and so prove at the November election, if Captain Tillman should be the nominee, we may hope that the Negro is approaching his second emancipation. Stackhouse presumably meant emancipation from the Republican Party, not from the status of laborer, but these were dangerous waters for a white Democrat. The conservatives played this theme for all it was worth. Some black men present at an 1890 campaign meeting were reported to be wearing Tillman badges. When their faces grew grave during a vitriolic Gary speech, a conservative shouted, "Better look out, the colored alliances are endorsing you." Charges that Tillman contemplated a break with Democratic white supremacy proved entirely misplaced, for it was Tillman's opponents who ultimately took that fatal step. Once Tillman gained the Democratic nomination, the hardline anti-Tillmanites of Columbia and the Low Country recognized that an independent ticket and an appeal to the Negro vote were the only chance of success, and Richland Democratic boss Alexander Haskell led a bolt from the party. This was a squarely reactionary move promising not equality or reform, but paternalist protection. For some Low Country elites, the identity of interest between the white landowners and black laborers was a better basis for political coalition than the strictures of Tillman's red shirt white supremacy. Black Carolinians, gubernatorial aspirant Haskell suggested, should look to white Carolinians of his class for protection, just as they had always done. "We have our own race to preserve," he wrote, "and another race to protect." But the Haskellites, still attempting against all odds to claim the name, straight outs, never presented a serious electoral challenge. If nothing else sufficed to make this clear, an approving letter from Daniel Chamberlain to Haskell should have done the trick. Letters between Haskellites suggest that they had come to hate Tillman so profoundly that they could only respond to his nomination by committing political suicide. They could not resist making unfavorable comparisons between Tillmanites and African Americans. "It seems to me," wrote one, "that a good, honest Negro would be better for governor than a white blackguard and his ignorant and malicious followers who are not farmers but rowdies." Broad Democratic participation apparently was no more desirable among white men than it was among black. Universal suffrage, wrote one Charlestonian, must prove a failure with an ordinary population of whites, but there are some Negroes better fitted for the exercise of the rights of citizenship than are many whites who actually vote. This was not just a statement of political theory, given the persistence of fusion arrangements and black voting in the Low Country. The Charleston News and Courier, covering its first election without Dawson at the helm, predicted that 50,000 qualified black voters would turn out and vote in a body as they are told to vote, but it required deliberate ignorance of the previous decade's events or a deeply contrarian spirit to believe that many whites would support this independent biracial coalition. "If our movement causes this much grief to the Tillmanites, it will pay us to have it made," wrote one Haskell supporter to another, even if Haskell knew he would be charged with folly or madness. most anti-Tillman Democrats could not justify voting against the party's nominee. Harry Hammond believed that a heap of good white folks and good Negroes in Carolina might successfully fight Tillman's Hamburg Massacre and Ellington riot government. But he gloomily confided to a conservative Charleston friend that the go-kart of party machinery has dwarfed the moral independence of our citizens, leaving them without the confidence to oppose the party nominee, in this case, tragically, Ben Tillman. If they had more courage, he surmised they might be willing to abandon the party rather than support such a man. But even non-reformers adopted Gary's language in this moment of apparent white supremacist crisis. Independent-minded Democratic legislator John Dargan, responding to rumors that he had joined the Bolters, wrote that those who appealed to black voters had stepped beyond the pale. Such men are not to be dealt with by an appeal to the ballot box or arguments. Tillman, for his part, fully expected to trounce his opponents, but he remembered to threaten retaliation if something went awry. Should the Haskellites try to count him out, Tillman declared, "We had better have a little war in South Carolina in 1890. African Americans themselves divided over the proper response to the Haskellite appeal for support. Black Republican leader George Murray thought the Democratic split offered the best opportunity for black voters since 1876, but a colored reform conference in mid-October could not resolve the issue of whether or not to support Haskell. Richard Carroll, a conservative Orangeburg minister, noted that Tillman put people to thinking on other things than the Negro, to which outraged opponents replied, Hamburg, Ellington. To some black men, the recent past demanded that black men do more than endorse the Bolters. Remembering the violence of 1876, James Robinson defiantly warned that if similar violence were brought to bear in 1890, Tillman won't have much longer to live. Murray, for his part, mistrusted the poor whites led on by men like Tillman, but he made no defiant threats. Like another pro-Haskell delegate who would prefer to work with the best native-born element than have the entire federal army for his protection, Murray would not challenge the paternalist language of protection so directly. Some who hoped the conference participants would stand like men and endorse Haskell had sought financial support from that faction. The conference ended inconclusively, but at the end of October, the Republican Executive Committee made prior arrangements official by urging Republicans to support Haskell. One reportedly said that the wealth and intelligence of the country should control and that the Haskell ticket represents that class. Running as an independent and seeking Republican support, Haskell won nearly 15,000 votes but gained a majority in only 2 heavily black low-country counties. Delighted white Democratic voters quickly relegated the Bolters to the same dustbin of history occupied by previous enemies. Some Democrats, feeling that the Haskellites had forfeited their racial status, derided them as white Negroes. One supporter asked Tillman, "Don't you think in our next primary all those parties should be dealt with as if they were black?" Tillman even worried privately that white men had proved themselves to be bossable. If they could be bought like drunken, driven cattle, white men, like black men, became unworthy to have a free vote and fair count. Had South Carolina fallen so far, demanded one newspaper editor, that it would rely on Haskell and his men as the guardians of our honor and our manhood, our self-respect and our self-defense? The Bolters' arrogant self-assertion betrayed the red shirt legacy. Haskellites had no sympathy with the people at large, wrote one Tillman supporter. A ruling aristocracy with serfs at command, this is their ideal, and their present attitude shows that they are careless whether their serfs be white or black or what befalls the state, if but they may rule. To many of South Carolina's good men, the cotton plant, reminded voters a few years later, had rather be controlled by the Negro, or as they hope, control white men by the Negro, than submit to the votes of the white trash, as they called them. The Bolt solidified the party behind Tillman. As one Democrat put it after the election, "I did not put on very largely of Tillmanism until Haskellism took the field. I had never sucked the radical Republican paps, nor gloated on greenback hopes, nor endorsed Haskellism, nor independentism, and I never will do either because I am a Democrat. The Haskellites had finished the work Tillman's unselfconsciously aristocratic critics had begun, and Tillman gloated privately at their generosity in giving me so good a club to break their heads. Why there was no populism in South Carolina. The Haskellite bolt further solidified Tillman's identification of himself with anti-aristocratic white unity. But even as Haskellites and their sympathizers fumed in defeat, Tillman faced a serious challenge from another quarter. Because he became governor of South Carolina as part of a national wave of agrarian protest, and because he drew support from the Farmers Alliance, Tillman was often mistaken for a populist. Local as well as national observers counted him as an alliance governor, and from the third party's inception in 1891, many alliance men expected him to support its challenge to both the Democrats and the Republicans. Tillman refused. Radical alliance and populist proposals went far beyond his modest program of reform and college building within a white man's Democratic Party. In particular, he feared the potential for federal control in the alliance's proposed sub-treasury, a system of government-owned warehouses in which farmers could deposit their crops and receive interest-free loans from the government of up to 80% of the crop's market value. The sub-treasury advocates claimed that it would break the crop liens cycle of credit and debt, turning the federal government into a servant of the producing classes rather than a tool of moneyed interests. As Lawrence Goodwin has argued, the sub-treasury was the heart of the populist challenge, and struggling white farmers in South Carolina and elsewhere seemed to agree. In many southern states, white populist leaders attempted to form political coalitions with black voters, appealing to their common agricultural hardships and offering the sub-treasury as an alternative to the crop lien, which oppressed both whites and blacks, owners, renters, and croppers. In nearby states, the leading Democratic insurgents against the Redeemers plunged into these waters, endorsing the sub-treasury and seeking alliances with black voters. Georgia's Tom Watson and Alabama's Reuben Kolb stepped across the political color line. In North Carolina, Leonidas Polk seemed ready to do so as well. Yet Tillman demurred. Conservatives accused him of being a populist, but if populism meant radical economic change through federal intervention, the creation of a third political party and an interracial political alliance, Tillman was no populist. By these standards, in fact, South Carolina populists had been the greenback Republicans of the early 1880s, and Tillman's position on such a movement had not changed. Tillman insisted that the war against the money power be seen as a continuation of the wars of secession and redemption. For him, reform meant the collective struggle of an independent white men against tyrannous federal authority and African American equality. In his view, the populists had made the critical error of believing that one could fight the money power by reforming a coalition with its chief allies, black Republicans, and the federal government. The sub-treasury, Tillman feared, would concentrate the business of the people in the hands of a centralized power at Washington. Moreover, it would create an army of political hirelings, guaranteeing the perpetuation in power of the party by which it was established. As for black political participation, that could only bring back Reconstruction and its concomitant evils. Negro domination hangs over us, he warned in 1891, like the sword of Damocles. Tillman's stand against the sub-treasury temporarily reunited him with conservative leaders, including his old commander Matthew Butler. As in 1876, the two men took similar positions on the relationship between federal power and Negro domination. Butler, debating populist Tom Watson of Georgia, suggested to an audience of white farmers that a mulatto would probably govern tyrannically your sub-treasury here, adding parenthetically that he knew Edgefield's man, probably a reference to one of the black Republican men who had held office in the county during Reconstruction. But Tillman's opposition to the sub-treasury created a deep rift within his coalition. Although he initially said he would submit to the will of an informed majority of alliancemen with regard to the sub-treasury, he opposed the sub-treasury in its details and suggested that a majority of South Carolina alliancemen did as well. He proposed a safe state-level alternative. state-chartered banks that could loan paper money based on the value of farm land. But this did not satisfy those with more expansive visions of reform. Indeed, it offered relief only to landowners and even narrower definition of farmers than the white male producerism Tillman had generally promoted. But radical alliancemen had counted Tillman's victory in 1890 as their own, and they would not willingly defer to him. In 1891, they invited sub-treasury advocates to speak, including Watson, who attracted large and enthusiastic Democratic crowds, and National Alliance lecturer Ben Terrell, a gifted orator from Texas who had taken the state by storm less than 2 years before. Tillman could avoid confronting the populist Watson, but he could not avoid debating Terrell, still nominally a Democrat. For once, Tillman got the worst of it. The State Alliance Convention rebuked him and endorsed the sub-treasury over his objections. Reporting on Tillman's debate with Terrell, the populist-leaning cotton plant spoke bluntly. Governor Tillman opposes the only measure that promises to break the power of a few men to rob the farmer. In Washington, D.C., the populist National Economist was even harsher, accusing Tillman of seeking the alliance's destruction. Tillman's opposition to the sub-treasury threatened to cost him his mantle of leadership. Even allies from the early days of the farmers' movement threatened to break with Tillman over the sub-treasury, and some seemed ready to support the third-party movement. A fellow sub-treasury opponent warned the governor that it was unwise for you to make an unnecessary issue with the farmers. Since the sub-treasury had been endorsed by alliances around the country, this reformer did not see how you can claim that it will be repudiated by the intelligent farmers of the South. His was one of many warnings to Tillman that he dare not alienate the alliance. In the case of the sub-treasury, Tillman decided that power mattered more than principle. Frightened by the hostile response of his alliance supporters and the possibility of losing all leverage with them, he first determined to remain absolutely silent and let things drift. By the time the 1892 campaign began, he went further, making a good show of capitulating to sub-treasury advocates. At the May 1892 Democratic Convention, the Alliance governor accepted the Alliance's national platform, including the sub-treasury proposal, and was present when the state Democratic Party adopted it. He did not become a sub-treasury advocate, however, and his more or less tacit consent could be interpreted in many ways. Even after the Democratic Convention, many were left wondering what was exactly his position regarding the Alliance's more radical demands. But the many white alliancemen who had come to see Tillman as their representative welcomed his apparent reversal as the return of the prodigal son. Tillman, after all, had embodied the farmers' movement since before the arrival of the alliance, and to many he remained a credible Moses. The reputation he had built since the mid-1880s stood him in good stead as he faced down this new challenge. As a county alliance president reassured him during the difficult days of 1891, "We have some complaints in this county, but will not come up wanting if you do not say too many nice things about those Citadel dudes." The tactical capitulation on the sub-treasury issue enabled Tillman to prevent state alliance leaders from taking the far more dangerous step of bolting from the Democratic Party. Tillman implored his more radical allies not to act precipitately. "Above all, let me beg you not to join any third-party move this year," he wrote to Alliance Democrat and U.S. Congressman A.C. Latimer, after it is clearly shown that no relief can be expected from the Democratic Party as now constituted. We may find it necessary to fight for relief under another name, but for the true principles of Jeffersonian democracy. The name itself is dear. Although he believed that eventually self-interest might force us to form a new party in coalition with Midwestern farmers, he insisted that for the time being, white Southerners had to stand together for God, for home, and for native land against the force bill and Negro domination. You cannot divide without bringing ruin. He told white audiences, for division in South Carolina means the Negro. In the worst case, the third party divides with white, and both factions appeal to the Negroes and that means in the long run, political debauchery and corruption with a final division of offices between the races and a return to the evils of the Reconstruction era. At public occasions such as the July 1891 meeting of the Edgefield County Farmers Alliance, he made his reform allies swear to fight for alliance demands with the Democratic Party. This, he later claimed, tied the hands of potential third-party leaders in South Carolina. As the 1892 political campaign began, though several upcountry Democrat county conventions nevertheless seemed poised for a third-party vote. In the 1892 election, Tillman once again attacked the conservative leadership of his own party and presented himself as a reformist alternative to populist radicalism. As luck would have it, an appropriate rallying cry for his middle ground was readily available in the form of free silver, insisting that the coinage of silver would expand the circulating medium sufficiently to alleviate the credit crisis. Tillman echoed bimetallists throughout the nation. The rhetoric of silver also suited Tillman's style of attack. For proponents of the white metal charge that the Reconstruction era demonetization of silver, the crime of 73, had been part of a Wall Street conspiracy against producers. Silver was also safe. Unlike the sub-treasury, it required no extension of federal power into local affairs. For some radicals, this made silver a sham, for it provided the appearance of reform without returning financial control to the producers. Perhaps for this reason, free silver provoked little controversy, even among the most conservative South Carolina Democrats. But free silver's enemies included Governor Cleveland, the likely Democratic nominee for the president in 1892, and the man to whom the populists would point in their campaign to woo South Carolina's Democrats. Advocacy of silver would allow Tillman to distinguish himself from Cleveland and to continue to offer at least the appearance of reform to white Democrats poised on the brink of revolt, attacking gold Democrat Cleveland as a bag of beef and threatening to stick a pitchfork in him, the threat that earned him his ever-after familiar moniker, Pitchfork Ben. Tillman attempted to remain the champion of the farmers while muffling more radical alternatives. The tactic worked. Although he continued to oppose any bolt from the party, he volunteered to lead the state against Cleveland's renomination. The delegation he led to the 1892 Democratic National Convention voted almost unanimously against Cleveland, but Cleveland's eventual nomination provoked no mass exodus from the party of white supremacy. Once again, Tillman had used violent attacks on an unworthy white man to establish himself as the spokesman of the farmers. Context of White Supremacy, and we will pick up there. That is 151, middle of 151 next week. We are halfway done. If you would like to participate, feel free. The quote for the summer: Negro domination hangs over us like the sword of Damocles. That is, I'm going to have to find a way to work that into an essay, a project. There's a plane going overhead. But I'm going to have to find a way to use that. That is the quote of the summer for 2015. Negro domination hangs over us like the sword of Damocles. Ben Tillman. They should put that at every single statue. That should be at Tillman Hall. That should be at the South Carolina State Capitol. That should be at Winthrop University. Everywhere where there is anything in reverence, in mention to Ben Tillman. He has a portrait, I think, on the campus of Winthrop. Negro domination hangs over us like the sword of Damocles. That alone is worth reading the book, in my opinion. I mean, it does not get any clearer. Man, Context of White Supremacy. I do have to do one serious thing. They mentioned Tom Watson as one of the populists of Georgia. He debated Ben Tillman, right? This is one where I can, even though I'm on vacation, I still got my history degree, and we have been on the grind for many years. So Tom Watson has been mentioned on this program many times. This is from Memories of a Race Traitor. This is white author Meb Segrest, I think is how you say it. Meb Segrest. She was on the program like 3 years ago. Anyway, in her book, she talks about Tom Watson, which she says, as racist propaganda and state-insinuated repression surged, racist violence escalated, fueled by a racist mythology. Philip Bruce explained in The Plantation Negro as a Freeman, 1889, that black males cut off from the civilizing influence of whites had regressed to African type and were raping white women. Cowbell. Whites rioted and murdered all over the South, lynching 2,060 blacks between 1882 and 1930, some of the victims children and pregnant women. It was not so much the African who had regressed. Some of the black victims were castrated, burned at the stake, decapitated, or blinded with hot pokers. In the 1880s and 1890s, a severe economic depression fueled an insurgent interracial populism that offered a radical challenge to the Southern elite. Tom Watson, foremost leader of Southern populism, was declared the Populist Party would settle the race question by presenting a platform immensely beneficial to both races and injurious to neither. Watson explained that race hatred rested on the keystone arch of financial despotism, which enslaves you both, and a money system which beggars you both. In Georgia in 1892, 2,000 armed white farmers came to the defense of a black populist threatened with lynching, and in 1896, Georgia populists denounced the lynch law. Blacks were admitted to the inner circles of the party, serving with whites as party delegates and officials, and speaking from the same platform to interracial audiences. Keep reading. The class, because this is not included in the book that we just read about Tom Watson. We just hear that he's debating Ben Tillman as though this is maybe a good white person. Maybe this Tom Watson is all right. Keep reading. The class alliance alarmed Southern conservatives who had made their alliances with Northeastern financial interests, and they mounted a campaign of repression using fraud, terror, and race baiting. Conservatives stole black votes, and populist party candidates were defeated by those forged ballots. The resulting frustration and bitterness dissolved the black-white coalition, leading the way for intensified racial repression and violence. Tom Watson turned racist and campaigned in 1906 on what Woodard calls a platform of Negrophobia, and dig this, since this came up before, progressivism. Yes, I will take my thank you, historian. Yes, reading history is very important, and it will generally just confirm the enormity of white pathology and depravity, terrorism against black people. Everyone who dialed in with a hand up, your line should be open. Let me get that in one more time. Negro domination hangs over us like the sword of Damocles. Quote of the summer. Everybody who dialed in with a hand up, you should be with us. Feel free to chime in.
Yes, can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay, on page 146, I think Bill Tillman is insinuating that by aligning yourself with the black vote, then you can lose your status as a white person. He's deriding them as white Negroes. And later on it said, one supporter asked Tillman, don't you think that your next primary, all those parties should be dealt with as if they were black? Tillman even worried privately that white men had proved themselves to be bossable. If they could be bought like drunk, driven cattle, white men, like black men, became unworthy to have a free vote and fair count. I think that says a lot about this guy, because not only do we believe that black people don't deserve a vote, but even white people that align themselves with him, he'll take the vote away from them also. And then one last comment on page 151. This is how he got his nickname, Pitchfork Ben. He was attacking a Democrat, Cleveland, and called him a bag of meat and threatened to stick a pitchfork in him. And that threat earned him the everlasting moniker Pitchfork Ben. You know, this guy is a violent racist, and then all of his violent tendencies are excused and even played up like it's something to be admired. And it's just amazing how a person like this is holding public office and then now is held up as a hero with statues and college institutions, buildings named after him. I'll mute mine.
Negro domination. All the other folks with us, feel free.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Well, you know, I wish that statement was true. I wish Negro domination. What is the sword of Damn? What is that?
It's like this guy like read a lot. Like he. Anyway, it's like this mythology in I think where the king, this white guy, where he sleeps literally. He has this sword over his bed, so this constant threat is with him. It's like a whole really, really famous long mythology with this. It's very, very popular in the annals of European history, European literature.
Wow, okay. Now, I wish I had this book so I could, at least had it to be reading with you, because what are the dates? What date are we at right now? I heard 73. Are we at 1873?
No, we are in like 1890, 1891-ish, 1890, 1891. They are constantly going back and referencing like 1876 and 1861, 1865. They're going back and referencing things that have happened over the last, I guess, 30 years or so, roughly. But we are at like 1890, 1891, right in there.
Okay. Because I only asked because the way I interpret history, we weren't citizens until 1871. So that's why I was trying, like, man, I think at 1870, are they trying to, I guess we really restructure white supremacy? Because, for that period from we were freed or emancipated to 1871 when the 14th Amendment was passed, we were pretty much free. We didn't have technically to follow the laws. We weren't citizens, we were, I don't know what you would call us, I guess free nationals at the time or whatever. But, it was a big deal for white people to put us under that citizenship brand. How come we got to follow these laws and these niggas don't? But very interesting. I can't wait to hear the first half because the way you were chuckling it up, I got to read that. I will hear that part. What I get from the whole thing right now is it's so easy, and I find this today because I always say, why are the white people in the South Republicans, man? They're poor. They live in trailer parks, not all of them, but a huge majority of them. In some of the poorest states like Mississippi, white people don't have it really going on like, white people in New York, or in Atlanta, So I'm like, what is it? But that constant, that they'll give up their welfare so niggas don't have it. It's like that, I don't know what to call it, but the narcissist type of mentality these white people have. Just a quick comment. I was on the elevator today, and this white guy asked me what did I think about, because it popped up on the television screen about the shooting And from what I know, this was all white people who were shot, right? In Louisiana yesterday.
I'm not sure about the victims.
Oh, okay. Well, that's what I got from watching the news. You know, the way they were, this poor teacher, you know, jumped on the other teacher. You know, I mean, I got it that these were white people. So I told him, man, I'll cry over spilled milk. You know what I'm saying? And he looked like, oh my God, you know. But you know, that's what I got from it. But yeah, that's just a term that I know it's a metaphor, but it was one that my grandfather would always use. You know, never cry over spilled milk. I thought it, it fit because these were white people. But yeah, very good, the book so far. I'm gonna go back and hear the first segment. And where are you at on vacation, Gus, if you don't mind me asking?
I will decline to disclose, but it is super cool. View of the water, it's great.
Okay. No problem. Well, you enjoy, and I'll mute my line.
For sure. Other folks had comments?
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Yes, during that time, correct me if I'm wrong, during that time, in around the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, there was a lot of important transitions to the system of racist white supremacy that was going on during that time. I believe what was called the tactic, which was called Reconstruction, was dwindling out, and things were allowed to be back like they were before Reconstruction, meaning the white property owners were allowed to come back in and still have the same terror leverage over non-white black people. Mind you, black people in a lot of these towns and areas in the southern part of this place were in the majority, so they had to establish a well-organized level of terror and of course deception, but terror also in order to keep the power dynamic over non-white black people in that area where Mrs. Tillman was waging terror himself. He was one of the main. I guess he was one of the main kingpins, at least in the state of South Carolina. It sounds like. So I find the book in that aspect interesting because it kind of like reinforced some things that I had an understanding of.
Right on. Any other folks have comments they wanted to make sure they get in?
I would like to briefly comment on the CFA. That was the Colored Farmer Alliance or Association. You know, it shows a form of black self-respect that these black people were not just sitting back allowing, these things to happen to them. They knew that they were being mistreated and even had some victory in getting the price of cotton raised to 50 cents per 100 pound. I think it was probably 10 cents before then. And then they were working on other areas. And they were even successful in forcing the political parties and even Bill Tillman to consider an alliance, with the black voters, whereas he would probably promise a lot of things that he would never deliver on, but still to find some value and significance in the black vote. I'll be my life.
Right on. If other folks have comments, we have about 17 minutes, maybe a little less. If you have comments you want to make sure you get in, just press *6. Please don't wait until the last minute. Thank you kindly. So on 143, number 1, where they're talking about getting some sort of legislation for segregation on rail cars. This is Mr. Tillman's running mate. And so he says, and this is Eugene Gary, Mr. Tillman's running mate. He says, what white man, Gary asks, wants his wife or sister sandwiched between a big bully buck, the alliteration there, dig that, and a saucy wench? That is another one. I have never in my life heard the phrase saucy wench before. Like that is a new one. That sounds like he's talking exclusively about black females. Like I'm gonna have to use that as well in the future. Saucy wench. Like wow. Anywho, so he go and cowbell, and that sounds like Dylann Roof. And then you go down. It says black alliance men engaged in heated debate over the proper stance. Oh, wait a minute. I skipped one. Wait a minute. Oh, no. Is this the same one? I think I missed it, but there was another. Oh, yes. Here we go. Tillman's campaign. One orator responded to Gary's attacks with his own statement of patriarchal authority and protection of black womanhood, declaring that if his wife was ever subjected to any indignity on the train, he would kill the man that attempted it for black self-respect, in my opinion. Black self-respect, in my opinion. Several examples of it already in this book, which I've said. I was just talking about that yesterday, and people assert all the time it is cliche and say that black people don't fight back, black people don't stand. That's consecutive books, at least 3 consecutive books, Malcolm X, Assata Shakur, Ben Tillman, where we have had examples of black self-respect, black counter-violence, black armed self-defense. That's 3 consecutive books. And even in the last book, Clifford Glover was mentioned when I did the research, and the article popped up, and the black people, they were upset. The white officer that killed Clifford Glover was exonerated, and black people got baseball bats and went and attacked white people. There's so many examples of black people. It's so much evidence that we have been anything but chumps and cowards. Black people have been fighting back for centuries now, and that is, in my opinion, it's monumental disrespect to our ancestors to suggest that we have been cowards and have not fought back. Even in a book like this, you still see examples of black self-respect. On 144, make sure I'm not repeating as well. Oh, when he says some Tillmanites privately suggested that the campaign attempt to control the Negro vote among Alliance Negroes for all our congressmen. Alliance President E.T. Stackhouse was confronted in early June with a document purporting to be a Marlborough County Black Sub-Alliance endorsement of Tillman. Stackhouse, although uncertain whether the declaration is honest or not, reportedly commented that if they are honest and so prove at the November election, if Captain Tillman should be the nominee, we may hope the Negro is approaching his second emancipation. Someone play this thing for all those words. Tillman badges. Yes, when he gets to the bottom, Gary, his running mate, when he says, better look out, the colored alliances are endorsing you. Again, this notion, if you have done something wrong, or there's some way that you can be associated with black people, that you've done something wrong. Even the fact that black people at all might be endorsing you is like, you have violated your manhood or your whiteness in some way. The code in the army of white supremacy. Let's see, making sure I didn't miss anything. Objection. Sorry for the plane overhead. Okay, on 145, I thought this one was really important. It says, so this is them talking about the possibility of having some sort of interracial coalition to oppose Ben Tillman, and maybe they can get some white people to buy into this. This is phenomenal. So he says, but it required deliberate ignorance of the previous decade's events or a deeply contrarian spirit to believe that many whites would support this independent biracial coalition. If our movement causes this much grief to the Tillmanites, it will pay us to have made it, wrote one Haskell supporter to another. Even Haskell knew he would be charged with folly or madness. Most anti-Tillman Democrats could not justify voting against the party's nominee. Harry Hammond believed that a leap of good white folks and good Negroes in Carolina might successfully fight Tillman's Hamburg massacre and Ellington riot government, but he gloomily confided to a conservative Charleston friend that the go-kart of party machinery has dwarfed the moral independence of our citizens, leaving them without the confidence to oppose the party nominee, in this case, tragically, Ben Tillman. I thought that was a great section, just starting off. It would require deliberate ignorance of the power of white supremacy to think that this was not going to be successful in viewing the way that things were going, and Ben Tillman in the party of white supremacy. And that's how it's identified in the book. That's not me saying that. That's how it was identified at the time. It was ludicrous. They said folly or madness to think that this was not going to be successful in Negro-dense South Carolina circa 1890. And I would say even that today, even a lot of the rhetoric in the text, it sounds very contemporary. Like particularly these gripes against the federal government and it being some sort of Negro-controlled federal government coming in to tell us what to do. I mean, that strangely sounds Tea Party-ish. What they call the conservative rhetoric sounds very similar to that. Ian Hani Lopez's whole book about dog whistle politics, it sounds very, very similar. I think some of the passage that I picked out specifically on 140, and I will say, at least for me, the pages or just the amount of text per page seems a little bit more, so it's a lot to go through. That's why it is sometimes taking me a little bit longer to dig through. But on one, but that's where my quote is. I gotta say it again. Negro domination hangs over us like the sword of Damocles. I have to say it again. But where he says that Tillman insisted that the war against the money power be seen as a continuation of the wars of secession and redemption. For him, reform meant the collective struggle of independent white men against tyrannous federal authority and African American equality. I swear that would fit right in today. Tyrannous, wasn't that what Timothy McVeigh was saying? I feel like it's been a lot of white people who have said the exact same thing. Dylann Roof, lots of these white people. Congressman, I forget his name, but the congressman, I think he's in either Alabama or Arkansas. I can get it for you in 1 second, but he declared publicly that there was a war against white people being waged by the federal government. He cited President Obama and Attorney General at the time, Eric Holder. But he just said this last August, towards the end of last summerish. Congressman, I think he got reelected this past fall. Let's see, there were some other passages. Oh, wait a minute. Let me make sure I finish the rest of that paragraph. In his view, the populist power the populist had made the critical error of believing that one could fight the money power by forming a coalition with its chief allies, black Republicans, and the federal government. The sub-treasury Tillman feared would concentrate the business of the people in the hands of a centralized power at Washington. Moreover, it would create an army of political hirelings, guaranteeing the perpetuation and power of the party by which it was established. As for black political participation, that could only bring back Reconstruction and its concomitant evils. And then he gets in one more time. Negro domination hangs over us like the sword of Damocles. Again, which is quote of the summer. Any other folks have anything they want to make sure they get in before we wrap things up?
Now, this book was written in 1990?
I think it was 2000 something, but I will double check. You might be correct. It might be 1990. It might have just been written. Nope, it was 2000.
Oh, in 2000. Okay. And how is he making these, is this stuff that Tillman wrote down, or? Oh, yeah. It's a lot of this is in quotes. I try to convey that sometimes with different inflections and what have you. It's challenging at times, but a lot of this is direct quotes from like newspapers, diaries, journal entries, letters, speeches that he gave publicly. Like a lot of this, I mean, this is a history book. This is like footnotes all the way through in the back, which are interesting themselves sometimes. But a lot of this stuff is in the news. I think I've been commenting on that a few times, that this is in the newspaper. Some of these quotes where they're saying the bond of, white unity and protecting white. This is stuff that was in the newspaper being said. Even some of his threats about black people and this sword of damn it. This is a direct quote. This is not him making this up. In fact, I can see if I can get exactly where that is from, where he is quoted to have said this. And I only asked because I was thinking, is the writer practicing racism? Like, is he making this stuff up, or like is he putting the words in Tillman's mouth? But if it's in quotes, then I'll take that back.
Yeah, it's directly quoted. Quite a bit of it. Let's see. I'll see if I can put my hand on that quote really quick, and that might do it, unless anybody else has anything they want to get in. Yeah, this is in chapter 476. So apparently he said this in the newspaper. This is Charleston News and Courier on July 25th, 1892. And then the Atlanta Journal, April 30th, 1891, quoted in the Charleston News and Courier, May 5th, 1891. So, yeah, apparently this was said in the newspaper. And this is the sort of thing that I enjoy. This is why I really dig having university access, because they have a lot of this stuff online now. So certainly, if you are in the Charleston, if you're in South Carolina, you should be able to get this easily. Like, you should be able to go, if you are close to the University of South Carolina, Clemson, Winthrop, any of the South Carolina State, any of the major universities in South Carolina, you should be able to access. If you go to the library, if you're a student, you should be able to access it anywhere. You should be able to go through access their archives. They should have a lot of this stuff is digital by now, but even if it's not, you should be able to go to the library and access this pretty easily. They should have all of this at the major universities, college institutions in South Carolina. And it says this was also, I guess, quoted in the Atlanta Journal. So if you are in Georgia, same would apply. You should be able to access Atlanta Journal, and you just go with the date, and bam. I mean, you can even be lazy about it and just go to the library. Atlanta Journal, I'll go to the library and Atlanta Journal. That's what I need. April 30th,
1891. Point me to, and they will go get it. Boom, boom, boom. Hook you up and do all the work for you. So you can be lazy about it. If you want those dates, anybody that wants to do some research to get the exact speech, because I would be interested in that. Like, I'm going to see if I have access to it, I will get it, I will share and bring it. If anybody else, if you want to do your homework on that, if you want the dates, I will gladly share them, so you can go and do some research and you can bring back to the group. But yeah, this apparently the Negro domination hangs over us like the sword of Damocles. Apparently that was quoted in a newspaper. Importance of reading the newspaper again. With that, I will assume we are all good. Everybody straight?
Yeah, quickly, I just wanted to say it doesn't surprise me that they made statues out of this guy and revere him like a hero. I mean, I can't think of too many people they even put on statues that aren't terrorists, white terrorists. I mean, all of them. I mean, just think of how many places are named after Columbus. I mean, hey, they don't revere you. White people, you're not nothing unless you're a white terrorist.
Absolutely, and this guy is a murderer and proud murderer of black people, so there we go. And really quick, just on the sword of Damocles. Some of you have asked, what is the sword of Damocles? Here's an explanation of the story of the sword and the relevant passage from Cicero in Latin. My explanation summarizes and paraphrases Cicero's Latin. However, if you want a literal translation, do a search. Translations of the page are available online. And it just goes on to talk about this prince who's under constant peril, as I said, with this sword overhead as he sleeps. Yeah, you can look online and get more about it. That's very, very popular in white literature, white culture, racist culture. It says, imminent, ever-present peril faced by those in positions of power. The Damocles of the anecdote was a obsequious courtier in the court of Dionysius II of Syracuse, a 4th century BC tyrant of Sicily. You can go on. They have lots online. You can read until your heart is content. Anywho, we'll be here tomorrow. Compensatory call-in. Still be on vacation, but we'll be here. 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Central. We'll be in workplace racism. We'll catch up, updates. I know Sandra Bland has been getting a lot of attention. Kendra Darnell Chapman as well. I'll be curious to hear updates on that. President Obama on the continent. Folks should be getting some attention that's going down, him being in Kenya and what they're talking about. There's always already been concern about him perhaps trying to push gay rights agenda while he's there, but that's certainly something to discuss. But we'll be here tomorrow for that. Pam should be here coming up on Wednesday as well. If you have confusion, problems, questions, feel free. If you would like the footnotes for those passages in the text, drop me an email and I will send them to you. As I said, I'm going to see if I can put my hands on those. If I can, I will share. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Really enjoyed the discussion and hope it was a constructive investment of your Friday evening. Remain safe. Codified, it would be best to remain sober under conditions of white terrorism. And if you are stopped by enforcement officers, comply. Unless you're ready to die in the next 2 minutes, unless you're ready to die, comply. You are in a weak position. Your behavior should reflect that. Comply. That's it. Creator, we ask that you help us remain patient with other black people. We ask that you help us remain patient with ourselves. Remind us to demonstrate the highest level of black self-respect at all times, in all places, each and every time we are in contact with another black person. It has been time. Replace white supremacy with justice immediately. Context of White Supremacy signing out. Thanks all for tuning in.
Nigga, you so brainwashed. I'm a victim, brother. Problem. You're a victim. I'm a victim of 400 years of conditioning. Shut up. The man has programmed my conditioning. Even my conditioning has been conditioned.